Hello and welcome to Snoozy Tour, where history turns into stories for sleep. Tonight, we're traveling back to the year 1847, when thousands of families left behind everything they knew to cross nearly 2,000 miles on the Oregon Trail. Forget the Hollywood version of brave pioneers riding off into the sunset. This was a journey of mud, hunger, bitter cold, broken wagons, and nights spent wondering if tomorrow would even come. Yet it was also a journey of laughter by campfires, fiddles echoing across the prairie, and children dreaming of apple trees waiting in Oregon. Over the next hour, you'll walk beside Thomas Benton and his family, through rivers that nearly swept them away, across snow-choked mountains, and into the lush Willamette Valley where hope finally bloomed. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the story of the Oregon Trail carry you westward, through hardship, humor, and the promise of a new beginning. The morning of departure came colder than Thomas Benton expected, a gray Missouri dawn in April 1847. The family cabin, his father's pride, built from oak logs cut with his own hands, was filled with a silence heavier than any church service. No one wanted to say it aloud, but they all knew. Today was the last time they would sleep beneath that familiar roof. Thomas lay on his straw mattress longer than usual, staring up at the smoke-darkened rafters. Every creak and groan of the timbers felt alive, like the house itself was watching, unwilling to let them go. His stomach turned in knots, equal parts excitement and dread. "Thomas, you up yet?" Ma's voice carried from the hearth. She had been awake for hours, already stirring cornmeal mush in the cast-iron pot, as though hot breakfast might soften the weight of goodbye. He sat up quickly, his bare feet hitting the cold plank floor. Tugging on his rough cotton shirt and patched trousers, Thomas muttered to himself, "No turning back now." Outside, the world was waking slowly. A thin mist curled across the fields, blurring the shape of the split-rail fence and the small family graveyard beyond. Two tiny crosses stood there, his baby brothers who hadn't survived their first winters. Thomas always glanced that way before leaving for the fields. Today the sight hit harder. They were leaving even the dead behind. Pa's voice boomed from the yard. "Come on, boy, we've got oxen to hitch." He sounded firm, but Thomas caught the quaver hidden underneath. Pa had been born in this cabin, raised on this patch of land. Leaving it was no easier for him than for anyone else. The wagon stood ready in the yard, canvas stretched tight over curved wooden hoops. It wasn't one of those grand Conestoga wagons Thomas had seen in traveler's sketches. Too expensive, too heavy. This was a simple farm wagon converted into what folks were calling a prairie schooner. Packed inside was everything they hadn't sold or given away: barrels of flour, sacks of beans, Pa's rifle and tools, Ma's Dutch oven and quilt, the family Bible, and Sarah's rag doll with one eye missing. Sarah herself sat on the wagon, tongue swinging her legs, her braids bouncing as she hummed. At 7 years old, she was more excited than anyone, too young to understand the dangers ahead. "You'll wear out that doll before we even get to Kansas," Thomas teased, ruffling her hair as he passed. She stuck out her tongue. "Better than you wearing out your boots. You'll be hobbling barefoot by summer." Pa chuckled at her sass while tightening the oxen's yokes. "She ain't wrong, boy." The oxen were hulking beasts, their hides rough, ribs faintly showing from the lean winter. Pa had traded 2 fine farm horses for them. "A horse might look noble," he told Thomas, "but an ox will pull you through hell and still eat grass where a horse starves." The family gathered for breakfast one last time inside the cabin. Ma's mush steamed in tin bowls, flavored with a rare slice of salt pork. They ate in silence, each savoring what they knew would be the best meal for months. Out on the trail it would be beans, hardtack, or whatever game the hunters could find. When the bowls were scraped clean, Ma folded her apron slowly, her eyes scanning the cabin as if committing every crack and shadow to memory. "Time to go," she whispered. They stood at the threshold a moment longer. Pa laid his calloused hand on the doorframe, then dropped it quickly, embarrassed at his own sentiment. Sarah ran back inside suddenly, placing her doll on the hearthstone. "You forgetting something, Squirt?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "No. I just want her to remember our house too." Then she snatched the doll back, clutching it fiercely to her chest. The wagon creaked into motion, wheels turning in groaning protest, as though they too disliked leaving. Thomas walked beside the oxen, his boots sinking in the damp earth of the yard. Behind them, the cabin shrank against the morning sky until it was just another shape among the trees. They passed neighbors who had gathered to watch the Benton family off. Mr. Wilkins, who had first planted the dream of Oregon in Pa's head, tipped his hat solemnly. Widow Jenkins dabbed her eyes with a kerchief. Children ran barefoot to the road's edge, waving until the wagon rattled out of sight. By the time they reached the meeting field, Thomas was stunned. More than 100 wagons stretched in a great circle, families bustling about, livestock lowing, children chasing each other through the dust. The smell of sweat, hay, and campfire smoke hung in the cool air. At the center stood the wagon master, Mr. Davidson. Tall, with a beard like a thicket and a voice that carried across the field, he climbed onto a wagon and raised his arms. "Folks," he thundered, "today we begin the long road to Oregon. 2,000 miles, half a year, maybe more. I won't lie, it'll break some of us. But if we stick together, if we work hard and fair, most of us will live to see that green valley. And when we do, it'll be worth every step." The crowd murmured. Some nodded firmly. Others shifted nervously. Thomas squeezed Sarah's small hand. She squeezed back, her eyes wide with excitement. At precisely 9 o'clock, Davidson fired a pistol skyward. The sound cracked across the field like a signal from heaven itself. Wagons HO. And just like that, the Benton family's world fell behind them, replaced by the rattling of wheels, the bawling of oxen, and the endless road stretching west. The field outside Independence buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Wagons clustered in rough lines, oxen lowed impatiently, and the shouts of men carried over the prairie wind. For Thomas Benton it was overwhelming. Yesterday their little farm had been the whole world. Today that world had expanded into more than 100 families, each with their own wagons, their own hopes, and their own fears, all bound together by the promise of Oregon. Pa guided their wagon into place near the middle of the line. "Better here than the edges," he muttered. "Middle's safer if trouble comes." Trouble, whether in the form of bandits stampeding buffalo or the Indians whispered about in town, wasn't something Thomas wanted to think about. But Pa thought about everything all the time. Around them, families bustled. A blacksmith hammered at a stubborn iron rim that had loosened from a wagon wheel. Children darted in and out of the crowd, shrieking with joy, as if this were a fair rather than the beginning of a 6-month ordeal. Dogs barked, pigs squealed from cages strapped to wagon beds, and chickens clucked in crates. "Stay close, Sarah," Ma warned, clutching her daughter's hand tight as they stepped down to stretch their legs. Sarah's wide eyes took in everything, the bustle, the noise, the chaos. "It's like a town all by itself," she whispered. Thomas wandered a few steps, careful not to lose sight of the wagon. Everywhere he looked were faces both familiar and strange. There were the Millers from town, with their brood of 5 noisy children. Old Widow Jenkins stood stiffly beside her son's family, clutching a shawl tight around her shoulders. And then there were newcomers, families he had never seen before, drawn here from Illinois, Kentucky, even farther. At the center of it all stood Mr. Davidson, the wagon master. He had the look of someone carved from the land itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with a sunburnt face and a beard that tumbled down his chest. His presence commanded respect even before he spoke. By mid-morning, the families gathered in a wide circle. Davidson climbed onto a wagon, his booming voice carrying without effort. "Folks," he began, "we are 430 souls strong. That's 120 wagons, near 2,000 oxen, and more livestock than I care to count. We travel together or we don't travel at all. Out here, there is no every man for himself. You break ranks, you die. Simple as that." The crowd murmured. A child began to cry, hushed quickly by her mother. "These are the rules," Davidson continued. "We travel by day, circle wagons at night. Every family takes turns with guard duty, scouting, and tending the livestock. If you're asked to work, you work. If you're asked to give, you give. Arguments will be settled by the Council of Captains, myself included. You don't like it, turn back now." A few men shifted uneasily, but no one stepped forward. They had come too far already. Davidson paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This road will break wagons, starve oxen, and bury some of us in shallow graves along the trail. Don't fool yourselves, it ain't easy. But if you make it, you'll have land enough for your children's children. Freedom. A new start. That's worth fighting for." The murmur swelled into voices of agreement. People nodded to each other, clapped shoulders, whispered encouragement. In that moment, the chaos of the field seemed to tighten into something like unity. Back at the wagon, Thomas found himself standing beside John Miller, the blacksmith's eldest son. John was about his age, tall and lanky with soot-stained hands. "Never seen so many wagons in one place," John said, shaking his head. "Feels like the ground itself might sink." Thomas grinned nervously. "Think they'll all make it?" John gave a short laugh. "Not a chance." Then, more seriously, he added, "But some of us will. That's what counts." The rest of the day was spent in preparation. Wagons were inspected, oxen fitted with yokes, provisions counted and recounted. Pa showed Thomas how to secure the barrels tighter, muttering that a loose rope today might cost them everything tomorrow. As evening fell, the wagons formed their first practice circle. It was less for defense. Davidson admitted Indians were unlikely to trouble them this early, than for order. Inside the circle, livestock were penned. Outside, campfires flared one by one, smoke twisting into the darkening sky. The smell of frying bacon and beans mingled with wood smoke. Families ate from tin plates, sitting on wagon tongues or logs pulled close to the fires. After supper, someone produced a fiddle. The thin, lively notes of, "Oh, Susanna," drifted into the night. A banjo joined in, then a harmonica. Children clapped, adults tapped their feet. Even Pa allowed a rare smile, tapping his boot to the rhythm. Thomas sat with Sarah near the fire, watching sparks float into the sky like tiny stars. "Do you think we'll really see Oregon?" Sarah asked softly. Thomas hesitated. "Pa says we will." "But do you believe it?" she pressed, her small hand tightening around his. He looked out at the endless prairie stretching into darkness. Somewhere out there lay rivers, mountains, deserts, and dangers he couldn't yet imagine. But he also thought of the promise, land enough to call their own, a place to build something bigger than this wagon, bigger than this moment. "Yes," he said at last. "I believe it." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, satisfied. As the music swelled, Thomas glanced around the circle of wagons. Families huddled close, fires flickering in the prairie wind. Strangers yesterday, they were now bound together by a fragile thread of hope. The real journey hadn't even begun, yet already, it felt like they were part of something larger than themselves. And tomorrow, when Davidson gave the call, that fragile hope would be tested on the long road west. The next morning broke with a clear sky and a sharp chill. Frost clung to the grass, crunching underfoot as families stirred from their tents. Smoke from dozens of fires rose straight into the still air. Thomas pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, watching his breath billow out in little clouds. At precisely 7 o'clock, a gunshot cracked the morning calm. Mr. Davidson's signal. "Wagons HO!" he bellowed from horseback, his voice echoing across the prairie. The sound was electric. Oxen were prodded into motion, wheels creaked, and the long line began to crawl forward. From a distance, it must have looked like some great serpent, its white-covered humps rising and dipping across the land. Thomas and Sarah walked beside their family wagon, boots crunching in the frozen mud. At first, the pace felt exciting. 2 miles an hour didn't sound fast, but when every wagon groaned forward in unison, the motion carried a sense of destiny. "Feels like we're part of an army," Sarah whispered. She tried to march in step with Thomas, her little legs pumping hard to match his stride. "More like a snail army," he muttered, adjusting the strap of the small bundle slung across his back. The first hours passed in a haze of chatter and laughter. Children raced ahead, daring each other to touch the lead wagon and sprint back before their mothers scolded. Men compared rifles, boasting of marksmanship. Women exchanged recipes for stretching beans into a week's worth of meals. But as the sun climbed higher, so did the dust. Dozens of wagons ground across the trail, churning the prairie earth into a choking haze. It clung to hair, clothes, and skin. It filled mouths and stung eyes. Every cough raised a new puff of grit. By midday, the novelty had worn thin. Sarah trailed behind, dragging her feet. "How much longer?" she moaned. "Another 170 days," Thomas teased, though the joke fell flat when she burst into tears. Ma lifted Sarah into the wagon bed for a while, settling her on top of a flour barrel. "She won't be the only one riding before long," Ma said, her voice tight with sympathy. Thomas knew she was right. Only the very young, very old, or the sick were supposed to ride, but already some grown men were nursing blisters the size of walnuts. Boots rubbed raw, backs ached, shoulders sagged. The reality of walking every mile was beginning to sink in. The oxen fared little better. Their hides gleamed with sweat, tongues lolling as they pulled the Benton wagon along the rutted track. Pa encouraged them gently with the goad, careful not to push too hard this early in the journey. "We'll need them strong when the rail climbing starts," he told Thomas. By late afternoon, the line of wagons stretched as far as Thomas could see. The sight filled him with both awe and unease. So many families, all tied to the same fate. If disaster struck, they'd face it together, or not at all. At Davidson's signal, the wagons slowed, then stopped for the day. The Benton wagon rolled into position as the circle formed. Teams were unyoked, oxen led into the center where the grass was still thick. Fires were lit, smoke curling upward against the orange sky. Supper was beans with a little bacon for flavor. Thomas ate from his tin plate, the beans gritty with trail dust. He longed for Ma's cornbread left behind with the cabin. As darkness fell, someone began singing. At first it was a single voice, thin and uncertain. Then another joined and another. Soon the circle of wagons pulsed with the sound of Sweet Betsy from Pike. Families sang together, their voices weaving through the night air. Thomas sat back, belly not quite full but heart strangely settled. The song reminded him that they weren't alone out here, not really. Later, lying in the tent beside Sarah, he listened to the prairie around him. The lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through grass, the distant bark of a coyote. It wasn't silence, but it was different from home. Wilder. "Thomas?" Sarah whispered in the dark. "Yeah. Do you think we'll see Indians soon?" Her voice trembled, though it was more curiosity than fear. "Maybe," he said honestly. "But Pa says most of them just want to trade. Don't worry. He knows what he's doing." She sighed, rolling closer to him. "I hope Oregon has beds." Thomas smiled in the dark. "Me too." He drifted off to sleep with that thought, the ground hard beneath his blanket, the night colder than he liked. Tomorrow would bring more miles, more dust, and more sore feet. But tonight, he let the sound of the wagon train, his new world, lull him into uneasy dreams. The first week on the trail blurred into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, hitch the oxen, walk until dusk, circle the wagons, eat beans, sleep, repeat. The landscape shifted slowly, woods giving way to prairie. By now, the Benton family's wagon had traveled nearly 100 miles west of Independence. Blisters had hardened into calluses, children had learned not to complain too loudly, and everyone had discovered that dust clung to skin like a second layer. But nothing so far compared to the challenge looming ahead, the Kansas River. The Platte might be shallow, the Missouri might be wide, but the Kansas was both wide and deep, with a current strong enough to drag an ox under. The wagon train reached its banks one hot afternoon, the water gleaming like a ribbon of steel under the sun. Thomas stood on the bluff, staring at the river that separated them from the rest of the West. "Looks mean," he muttered. "Meaner than it looks," Pa replied grimly. Davidson rode up and raised his hand for silence. "Folks, this is our first big crossing. There's a ferry here, $2 a wagon. Steep price, I know. But try to ford it and you risk losing everything." The murmurs started immediately. $2 could buy 20 pounds of flour. For families already counting every coin, it felt like robbery. "Highwaymen without the highway," one man grumbled. Davidson's eyes hardened. "I've seen wagons capsize. Supplies lost. Folks drowned. $2 is cheap compared to burying your kin." That silenced most of the complaints. The ferry wasn't much to look at, a raft of logs lashed together, big enough for one wagon at a time. Poles guided it across while the oxen swam beside, urged by shouts and ropes. Watching the first wagon roll onto it made Thomas's stomach knot. The raft dipped alarmingly under the weight, water sloshing over the edges. "Hold steady," Davidson barked, riding along the bank. The polers strained, muscles taut as the current pushed them downstream. For a moment, it looked like the raft would spin out of control, but slowly, painfully, it inched toward the far shore. Cheers erupted when wagon and oxen rolled safely onto dry land. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "One down," Pa muttered. 119 to go. The second crossing went smoother, the ferrymen learning from their mistakes. By dusk, only half the wagons had crossed, the others making camp on the near bank. Fires dotted both shores like twin necklaces of light, the voices of families calling across the water. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay staring at the canvas roof of the tent, listening to the rush of the river. Every splash of water made him imagine wagons tipping, people screaming, oxen bawling. The river seemed to whisper, "Some of you will not pass." Morning came too soon. The Benton wagon was scheduled for the crossing before noon. Ma packed everything carefully, wrapping precious flour and coffee in oilcloth, tying down every crate. Pa checked the oxen, tightening ropes with nervous hands. When their turn came, Thomas's knees felt weak. The wagon creaked onto the raft, the logs groaning beneath its weight. He stood beside Sarah, who clutched her doll so tightly its cloth arm bent backward. "Don't drop her," Thomas whispered. "I won't if you don't drop me," she shot back, her eyes wide. The raft lurched into the current. Water splashed up, soaking Thomas's boots. The oxen bellowed as they were forced into the river, their massive bodies thrashing against the current. For a terrifying moment, the raft swung sideways. Pa shouted, grabbing a rope, pulling with all his strength. The ferrymen shoved hard, correcting the drift. Inch by inch they crept forward. Thomas gritted his teeth, clinging to the wagon's side. He imagined the river laughing at them, daring them to falter. But then, suddenly, they were across. The wagon rolled onto the far bank with a thud that made everyone cheer. Ma sank to her knees in the mud, whispering thanks. Pa's face was pale beneath his beard, but he clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Held steady, son. That's what matters." Not everyone was so lucky. That afternoon, disaster struck the Jenkins family. Their wagon rolled onto the raft, but halfway across, one of the logs shifted. The raft tilted violently. Supplies spilled, barrels rolling into the current. The wagon toppled sideways with a sickening crash. Screams filled the air. The Jenkins parents clung to the canvas, their children thrown into the water. Men on both banks dove in, ropes flying, shouts echoing. Thomas froze, heart hammering, until he saw a small hand flailing downstream. Emma, the Jenkins girl, Sarah's age. Without thinking, Thomas kicked off his boots and leapt into the water. The river swallowed him instantly, icy and roaring. He fought to keep his head above water, eyes fixed on that tiny hand. The current dragged him mercilessly, but he angled downstream, lungs burning, arms aching. At last he reached her. Emma's dress had snagged on a submerged branch, her head barely above water. He grabbed her just as she slipped under. "Hold on," he gasped. She clung to him, nearly dragging him under. His vision blurred. Then, a rope. He seized it with one free hand, and men hauled them both to shore. They collapsed in the mud, coughing, shaking. Emma was whisked away to her sobbing parents. Pa wrapped a blanket around Thomas, his arms trembling as he pulled his son close. "All safe," Pa murmured, voice thick. "Thanks to you, boy. All safe." That night, Thomas sat by the fire, exhausted and half-frozen. The Jenkins family came to their wagon, pressing a small jar of honey into Ma's hands, the only luxury they'd saved. "For your boy," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice breaking. Davidson himself clapped Thomas on the back. "To God's son. The kind we'll be needing before long." Thomas said nothing, staring into the flames. His body still shook from the cold, his mind from the memory of the river's grip. But inside, something had shifted. He was no longer just a boy on the trail. He was part of its story now. The Kansas River crossing left the wagon train shaken. Though everyone survived, the Jenkins family had lost nearly all their belongings. Families pooled supplies. Flour from one, beans from another, spare canvas from a third. But the truth was plain. Every mishap ate into the group's margin for survival. For a few days afterward, the trail was mercifully smooth, cutting across rolling prairie under wide blue skies. Oxen plodded, wheels creaked, children laughed again. It almost felt like normal life, except normal life didn't leave dust in your teeth or blister your feet raw. But by late May, the weather turned. The first storm arrived with little warning, black clouds boiling up from the horizon. The prairie sky seemed endless until it decided to press down like a giant hand. A sudden wind whipped through the wagon canvas, making it snap like sails in a storm at sea. "Cover the goods," Pa shouted, scrambling to pull tarps tighter. Thomas and Ma helped, their fingers fumbling with wet ropes as the first fat drops of rain fell. Within minutes, the trail turned into a river of mud. Oxen bawled, their hooves sinking deep. The storm lasted all night. Rain hammered the canvas roof, dripping through seams no matter how carefully they'd been tarred. Sarah cried softly, clutching her doll, both of them damp despite Ma's efforts to keep them dry. Thomas lay awake, teeth chattering, listening to the endless drumming of water. By morning, the camp was unrecognizable. Wagons tilted in the mud, fires refused to light, clothing clung heavy and cold. The air smelled of wet earth and animals. Davidson's order was simple: move. The train lurched forward, oxen straining with every step. Wheels sank deep, sometimes half-buried, requiring whole teams of men to push and pry them free. Thomas joined the work, his boots caked so thick with mud they felt like lead. Every step pulled like the earth itself was trying to claim him. By midday, tempers flared. One man cursed his oxen so loudly that Davidson rode over, dismounted, and seized the whip from his hand. "Beat your animals, you'll answer to me," the wagon master growled. The man muttered an apology, but his glare lingered long after Davidson rode off. For the children, the mud became both misery and entertainment. Sarah and Emma trailed behind, giggling as they pretended to skate across the muck, earning sharp words from Ma. "This isn't play," she snapped, though even she couldn't entirely hide a smile at their antics. The storm's damage became clear when the Wilsons' wagon axle snapped in the sludge. The wheels sagged sideways, the wagon lurching dangerously. Everyone groaned. Repairing such a break could take hours. But the wagon circle came alive with cooperation. Men fetched spare wood, women passed tools, children carried water. Pa worked alongside Mr. Wilson, sweat streaming despite the chill. By sunset, the axle was splinted, the wagon creaking forward once more. That night, the camp was a swamp. Fires smoked and hissed, refusing to burn hot enough for proper cooking. Supper was half-cooked beans and soggy biscuits. Still, people ate because hunger cared little for taste. Thomas slumped beside Pa at their fire, his body aching. "How much worse does it get?" he asked. Pa poked at the reluctant flames. "Plenty worse. Mud is just the beginning." Sleep was hard to come by. The ground sucked heat from their bodies, and mosquitoes rose in clouds from the wet grass. Thomas drifted in and out of restless dreams, oxen sinking into endless bogs, wagons swallowed whole. The next day brought no relief. If anything, the trail grew worse. The sun returned, but instead of drying the land, it baked the mud into ruts deep enough to snap wheels. Wagons jolted and pitched violently, tossing children against the sides. Oxen stumbled, their ribs sharp beneath thinning hides. Arguments broke out more often. Whose turn it was to fetch water. Whose oxen blocked the trail. Whether Davidson was pushing too hard or not hard enough. Each family clung to its supplies, weighing generosity against survival. Yet there were moments of grace. That evening, Widow Jenkins offered Ma a small pouch of dried apples, one of the last treats from home. Ma stewed them into a thin dessert that made Sarah and Emma smile for the first time in days. Around the campfire, laughter returned, fragile but real. Davidson called a meeting. His voice carried through the damp air. "Folks, this is the way of the trail. Rain, mud, breakdowns, they'll dog us all the way to Oregon. Don't let it break your spirit. Remember why you came. Land. Freedom. A future worth the pain." Thomas listened, trying to let the words soak in like dry ground drinking rain. He thought of the cabin back in Missouri, of neighbors left behind, of the graves in their family plot. And he thought of Oregon, that green valley everyone spoke of with shining eyes. Maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. That night the sky cleared. Stars glittered brighter than Thomas had ever seen, the Milky Way spilling across the heavens like a river of light. He lay on his blanket, Sarah curled against his side, Emma breathing softly nearby. "Still worth it?" Sarah murmured sleepily. Thomas didn't answer right away. His muscles ached, his skin itched with bites, his stomach growled with hunger. But above them, the stars stretched endless and bright, and for a moment, the misery of mud and rain felt small against the vast promise of the West. "Yes," he whispered at last. "Still worth it." The storm had passed, but the prairie was never content to leave the wagon train in peace for long. After days of slogging through mud, the ground dried under a relentless sun. Grass sprang back tall and thick, golden waves rolling to the horizon. The air grew hot and still, so dry that lips cracked and tempers flared at the slightest spark. The Benton family was walking beside the wagon one afternoon when Sarah wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" Thomas sniffed. The scent was faint but unmistakable: smoke. Within minutes, others noticed it too. Davidson rode ahead, scanning the horizon. Then he shouted, his voice carrying like a thunderclap, Fire. Prairie fire to the south. Every head turned. A low, dark line marred the horizon. At first it seemed far away, harmless even. But as the wind shifted, the line grew, rolling upward into black columns. Flames licked above the grasses, a wall of fire racing toward them faster than any ox could pull. Peace's face went grim. "Lord help us," he muttered. The camp exploded into action. Families shouted, oxen bellowed, children cried. The wagon circle tightened instinctively, but Davidson barked new orders. "Circle won't save you from fire. Clear a fire break. Now." Thomas didn't know what a fire break was, but Pa did. He seized Thomas by the arm. "Grab a shovel. We're cutting the grass down, fast." Men and boys hacked at the prairie with shovels, axes, and whatever tools they had, scraping away dry grass to bare soil. Women dragged blankets and coats to beat at small flames sparked by the wind. Smoke thickened, acrid and choking, burning eyes and lungs. Sarah clung to Ma's skirts, coughing. Emma stood beside her, eyes wide with terror. "Will it burn us up?" she whispered. "Not if we do our part," Ma said firmly, though her voice shook. She shoved the girls toward the wagon. "Stay inside. Don't come out until I say." The line of fire grew larger with terrifying speed, advancing with the wind like a living beast. Heat rolled ahead of it, a dry furnace that withered the grass in seconds. "Not enough," Pa shouted over the roar. "It's coming too fast." Davidson spurred his horse into the circle. "Backfire," he roared. "Light a backfire." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then comprehension spread, fighting fire with fire. Men snatched torches from the cooking flames and dashed to the edge of the freshly cleared strip. They bent low, setting the dry grass alight. Thomas watched in horror as new flames sprang up right beside them. "We're setting more fires?" Pa's hand gripped his shoulder. "It'll burn back toward the big fire, use up the fuel before it reaches us. Trust it." The two walls of fire rushed toward each other, the small controlled backfire and the towering inferno sweeping across the prairie. The sound was like a freight train, a low, thunderous roar that rattled the earth beneath Thomas's boots. He worked until his arms screamed, beating down stray sparks with a blanket, stamping out smoldering tufts. Smoke coated his tongue, thick as ash. Around him, the wagon train became a blur of frantic motion. Men shouting, women hauling water, children wailing inside the wagons. Then, with a deafening rush, the two fires met. The world turned into a boiling cauldron of heat and smoke. Thomas shielded his face, eyes streaming. For a moment, it seemed the entire prairie would vanish in flame. And then silence. The great wall of fire sputtered where it had no more grass to consume. The backfire had done its work. Beyond the blackened strip lay smoking earth, charred but safe. The flames leapt high a final time, then dwindled, crackling as they raced sideways along the prairie, away from the camp. The wagon train stood in stunned silence. Smoke curled upward in dark towers, blotting out the sun. Oxen trembled, their eyes rolling white. Families clutched each other, coughing and weeping. Pa dropped his shovel, sweat streaming down his soot-blackened face. He leaned against the wagon, chest heaving. "We made it," he rasped. "By God, we made it." Davidson rode through the camp, his horse flecked with ash. "Good work," he shouted hoarsely. "We stood together and we lived. Remember that. Out here, you'll need each other to survive." Slowly, life returned to the camp. Buckets of water doused smoldering spots. Blankets were wrung out, wagons inspected for damage. Ma tended to burns on one man's hands, wrapping them in strips of linen. Children crept out from hiding, their faces streaked with ash and tears. That night, the sky glowed red for miles, the prairie still burning in the distance. The air smelled of smoke and char, acrid and bitter. Families huddled close, grateful for every breath. Sarah sat curled in Thomas's lap, her hair smelling of ash. "I thought it was the end," she whispered. "So did I," Thomas admitted. "But it wasn't." She looked up, eyes bright in the firelight. "We beat it, didn't we?" Thomas thought about the line of blackened earth that now marked their campsite, a scar across the prairie. "Yeah," he said softly. "We beat it." When he lay down that night, his body ached from exhaustion, his lungs burned, and his skin stung with tiny burns where sparks had landed. But beneath it all was something else, pride. They had faced fire and lived. And tomorrow the wagons would roll west again, into whatever new trial the prairie held next. The prairie fire left everyone shaken, but the wagons rolled west as always. The blackened earth stretched for miles, a grim reminder of how close they had come to being consumed. Yet there was no time for mourning near misses. The trail always demanded more. By late September, the air grew cooler in the mornings, crisp and sharp. The grass turned yellow, the prairie beginning its slow march toward winter. With the change of seasons came a new trial: sickness. It began with the Wilson boy, Jacob, no more than 8 years old. He had been quiet one evening, refusing his supper of beans and bacon. By morning he was feverish, his lips cracked, eyes glassy. His mother tried willow bark tea, but the boy's stomach rebelled against even the smallest sip. Within 2 days, others were coughing, moaning with fever, struck with the same invisible enemy. Whispers spread through camp: cholera. The dreaded word hung heavier than any storm cloud. Thomas watched fear flicker in Pa's eyes, though he tried to hide it. "Could just be fever," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow after digging the Wilsons' new latrine farther from camp. "Not cholera. Not this far north." But the truth was obvious as more fell sick. Wagon after wagon reported the same symptoms: vomiting, cramps, unbearable thirst. The trail was littered with graves from cholera, hastily dug mounds with wooden markers already weathering in the prairie sun. Now it had come for them. The Benton family did their best to stay vigilant. Water barrels were scrubbed, food carefully boiled. Ma kept Sarah and Emma close, forbidding them to play with the other children. "Not until this passes," she said firmly, though Sarah's pout made her look ready to argue. Despite their precautions, death visited the train. One gray morning, Davidson rode through the line and halted the wagons. The Petersons' eldest daughter, Mary, just 15, had died in the night. The girl had been laughing and singing only a week before. Now she was gone, her body wrapped in a quilt and laid gently in the earth. The funeral was brief. Time didn't allow for long grieving. The wagons couldn't linger with winter creeping closer. A prayer was said, the hymn "Nearer My God to Thee" hummed low through cracked voices, and then the train moved on. The grave disappeared behind them, lost to the endless prairie. That night, Thomas lay awake beside the fire, Sarah curled against him, her rag doll in her arms. He stared at the stars, thinking of Mary Peterson. They were both the same age. He couldn't reconcile how one moment someone could be laughing, and the next they were nothing more than a name carved into a wooden cross. Why does God take the young ones? Emma asked quietly, seated across the fire, her face pale and serious. Seems wrong. No one answered. Even Pa, who always had something to say, simply poked at the fire with a stick, jaw set tight. The sickness continued its quiet rampage. Not every case was fatal, but each loss hollowed the group a little more. Families who had started the journey with 6 or 7 now counted 5 or 4. The laughter of children around campfires grew thinner. Yet even amid death, life stubbornly pushed forward. One evening, Widow Jenkins, traveling with her son's family, announced that her daughter-in-law had given birth. The camp buzzed with a strange mixture of grief and joy. A child born on the trail. Some called it a good omen, proof that the land ahead promised new beginnings. Others muttered that bringing new life into such hardship was cruel. When Thomas first laid eyes on the infant, tiny and red-faced, he felt something stir in his chest. The baby's cry pierced the heavy silence of the camp, a reminder that life could defy even the bleakest days. Pa seemed to think the same. "Trail takes," he said quietly as they walked back to their wagon. "But it gives too, sometimes." The wagons pressed on. A week later, another grave joined the long line dotting the trail. This time an older man, Mr. Harris, who had been struggling with a cough since independence. His wife walked beside the wagon silently afterward, her face like stone. Death was no longer a surprise. It was an unwelcome companion, walking just beyond the circle of firelight each night. But the living clung to whatever sparks they could find. Fiddle music returned in fits and starts, sometimes just a single tune before grief silenced it again. Children still chased prairie dogs at rest stops. Aunt Sarah, ever determined, whispered stories of their Oregon farm to Emma as though willing it into existence by sheer imagination. As October approached, Thomas noticed how Pa's back seemed more bent each evening, his steps heavier. But still, he rose before dawn, hitched the oxen, and marched west with grim determination. The Oregon Trail was merciless, but so were those who dared walk it. For every grave left behind, there was also a wagon that kept rolling, wheels creaking toward the promise of something better. And Thomas began to understand something he hadn't before. The Oregon Trail was not just a road of death. It was a test. A crucible that burned away weakness, leaving only those stubborn, or desperate, enough to endure. The wagon train rolled steadily westward, the endless prairie finally breaking into rougher land, ridges, gullies, and the winding course of the North Platte River. Dust no longer clung to everything. Now it was mud and stone that tested wagon wheels and oxen alike. The horizon, once flat as a board, now rippled with distant hills. Fort Laramie appeared like a miracle after weeks of nothing but sky and grass. Not the stone fortress Thomas had pictured in his boyhood dreams, but still a bastion of civilization in the wilderness. A handful of sturdy log buildings, a flagpole with the stars and stripes snapping in the wind, and soldiers in blue coats drilling on the parade ground. To the Benton family, it looked like a city. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide. "Is that Oregon?" Pa chuckled, though there was no real humor in his tired voice. "Not quite, Squirt. Just a place to catch our breath." The fort's trading post was the busiest place Thomas had ever seen. Immigrant wagons crowded its yard, oxen bellowing as their owners haggled with sharp-eyed traders. Prices were outrageous and everyone knew it. Still, families traded precious items to replace worn supplies. Flour, salt, coffee, gunpowder. Pa reluctantly pulled Ma's silver brooch from a pouch. It had been her wedding gift, passed down from her mother. She pressed it into his hand with a tight nod, her lips thin. "It'll buy what we need." They traded it for 2 sacks of flour and a small bag of coffee. Pa muttered about highway robbery the whole way back to the wagon, but Ma simply looked east, her eyes misty. "It'll get us to Oregon. That's worth more than silver." The fort wasn't just a market, it was a place of news. Soldiers and traders swapped tales from the trail. Some said the Sioux were restless this year, tired of wagon trains cutting through their hunting grounds. Others spoke of gold found in California, drawing fortune seekers farther west. But the most important news was closer to home. The trail beyond Fort Laramie was rough but passable. That night, Davidson gathered the train in the fort's yard. "Listen up, folks," he said, his voice carrying in the cool evening air. "From here the easy part's done. The mountains are ahead and with them rivers, cold, and snow. If you have doubts, better stay here for the winter." Silence hung over the crowd. A few families whispered among themselves, weighing the risk. In the end, only 2 wagons decided to remain. The rest stood firm. They had come too far to turn back. For the Benton family, the days at Fort Laramie felt like both a blessing and a curse. The oxen rested on fresh grass, Ma washed clothes in the river until her hands turned raw, and Sarah chased Emma around the parade ground until the soldiers scolded them for getting in the way. Yet beneath the small comforts lay unease. The talk of snow in the mountains gnawed at everyone. On their last evening at the fort, Thomas wandered near the riverbank. He ran his fingers over a carving etched into a boulder by earlier travelers, Benton family, 1845. The name jolted him. He called Pa over, and together they traced the letters. "Kin?" Thomas asked. Pa shook his head slowly. "Not that I know of, but maybe." Folks scattered all over. Could be blood, could just be chance. He paused, then gave Thomas a look. "Either way, they passed this way before us. Means we can too." The next morning, Davidson gave the order to move out. Families packed hurriedly, soldiers waving them off from the fort's gate. Sarah clutched her rag doll tight as their wagon rolled away. "Bye, Oregon City," she called. Thomas laughed. "Not yet, Squirt. We've still got 1,000 miles to go." The train followed the North Platte west, the river a silver ribbon beside them. At first, the land seemed friendly enough, rolling meadows, stands of cottonwood trees. But soon the trail narrowed into stony ridges where wagons jolted dangerously and men had to brace wheels with rocks. At the river crossings, tempers flared. One wagon's oxen balked in the current, panicking and overturning the load. Barrels and sacks tumbled downstream while men dove into icy water to save what they could. The family stood weeping on the bank, watching half their supplies vanish. Other families contributed what they could spare, but it was a grim reminder of how thin their margins had become. One evening, a storm swept down from the hills. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. Lightning flashed over the prairie, throwing shadows across the wagons. Rain poured in sheets, soaking everything, turning the camp into a swamp. Children huddled under blankets, oxen bawled, and the firewood turned to useless, sodden piles. Thomas sat with Pa in the wagon, listening to the storm batter the canvas. "Think we'll make it?" he asked quietly, surprising himself with the question. Pa stared out into the rain, then placed a rough hand on his son's shoulder. "We've made it this far, and we'll keep on. That's all we can do. 1 mile at a time." The words didn't erase the fear, but they planted something steadier in Thomas's chest, a seed of determination. By the time the storm passed, the wagons were soaked, the people worn down. Yet the train kept moving. The prairie had taken its toll, but Fort Laramie had given them just enough, supplies, news, and a brief breath of civilization, to remind them why they pushed forward. Oregon still lay impossibly far away beyond rivers, deserts, and mountains. But with every turn of the wagon wheels, the promise grew louder in Thomas's mind. Land, freedom, a place to call their own. And so, soaked and weary, the wagon train rolled west once more, toward trials no one could yet imagine. The North Platte carried the wagon train deeper into the wilderness. The wide, muddy river was both a lifeline and a barrier, its course winding through broken country that seemed rougher with each passing day. The land rose slowly and the air grew thinner, crisper. Gone were the endless seas of prairie grass. Now red cliffs loomed on the horizon, broken by dark forests of pine. "These are the Black Hills," Davidson announced one morning, his voice carrying down the wagon line. "Sacred country. Keep your eyes open and your rifles clean." The words sent a ripple of unease through the families. Everyone had heard stories, of wagon trains surrounded, of horses stolen, of travelers who vanished and were never seen again. Thomas walked beside Pa, scanning the ridges. The hills seemed alive, every shadow a watcher, every rustle in the pines a whisper. For 2 days, the journey wound through narrow valleys where the wagons creaked against sheer walls of stone. At night, fires were kept low and men took double watches. Thomas, allowed on sentry duty for the first time, gripped Pa's pistol so tightly his hand ached. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the distant howl of wolves and the restless stamping of oxen. On the 3rd morning, the Sioux came. They appeared without warning, a line of riders cresting a ridge above the trail. Painted faces, tall men draped in buffalo robes, feathers snapping in the wind. Their ponies moved with effortless grace, circling the wagons like wolves testing a herd. Sarah clutched Thomas's sleeve, her eyes wide with terror. "They're going to take us," she whispered. "Not if we keep calm," Pa muttered, though Thomas noticed his knuckles whitening on the rifle stock. Davidson rode out alone, raising his hand in greeting. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then one of the Sioux broke from the group, a man with a hawk feather in his hair and a long spear in his hand. He rode down slowly, meeting Davidson between the wagons and the ridge. The 2 men spoke, words Thomas couldn't understand, though he caught tones of command and wary respect. When Davidson returned, his face was grim but not fearful. "They don't want a fight," he told the gathered families. "They want trade. Meat and hides for coffee, sugar, and powder. Fair trades only. Do it and we pass through." The camp relaxed only slightly. Families gathered what they could spare. A sack of beans here, a pouch of coffee there, bits of bright cloth Ma had packed just for this. In exchange, the Sioux offered buffalo meat, robes, and moccasins soft as butter compared to the worn-out boots of the travelers. When one of the warriors approached the Benton wagon, Pa nodded to Ma. She stepped forward with a small tin of sugar, her hand steady though her eyes flickered nervously. The Sioux man examined it, sniffed, then grunted approval. He handed over a robe heavy with fur. Sarah and Emma peeked from the wagon. The warrior noticed, his painted face unreadable. He reached into his robe and withdrew 2 tiny dolls of buckskin, each with beaded dresses and hair made of real horsehair. He held them out silently. Ma hesitated, then nodded. Sarah's trembling hand took the doll, followed by Emma's. Both girls clutched the gifts as though they were treasures from heaven. The warrior touched his chest and said something that sounded like "we." Then he mimed a river crossing, arms sweeping in a broad motion, and pointed west. "What's he saying?" Thomas asked. Mr. Wilson, who had traded with tribes before, translated. "Warning us. River ahead's bad this time of year." The warrior gave a final nod, then turned and rode back to his people. Moments later, the Sioux vanished into the hills as suddenly as they had appeared. That night, the wagon circle was tighter than ever. Men sat with rifles across their knees, though the Sioux had shown no sign of hostility. Sarah clutched her doll as she drifted to sleep, whispering to it about Oregon. Emma whispered back with hers, the two girls creating stories to chase away the fear. Around the central fire, Pa shook his head. They could have taken what they wanted. Outnumbered us easy. But they didn't. Maybe they're not all savages like folks back home say, Ma murmured, staring into the flames. Pa didn't answer, but Thomas saw the thoughtful crease in his brow. 2 days later, the wagon train reached the river the Sioux had warned about. The North Platte here was swollen with autumn rains, wide and deceptively fast. The scouts returned with grim faces. No good ford. Too deep. Too strong. Davidson's jaw tightened. Then we float the wagons. Strip him down, seal the boxes with pitch, and pray the current's merciful. The work consumed the rest of the day. Wheels were removed, seams sealed with tar, goods packed tight. Thomas worked beside Pa until his arms ached, the smell of pitch clinging to his hands. By dawn, the first wagon was ready. It floated like a crude boat, guided by ropes and poles as men waited alongside. The oxen swam, eyes rolling in panic. The current tugged hard, but the wagon made it across. Cheers rose on the far bank. Not every crossing went so well. Midway through, the Peterson wagon struck a hidden rock. It lurched sideways, water pouring in. Shouts echoed across the river as men dove to salvage what they could. Flour and seed corn vanished downstream. The Petersons stood weeping, watching half their future swept away. That evening, campfires burned low. Families shared what little they could with the Petersons. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Without seed corn, the Petersons' chances of thriving in Oregon were slim. Thomas lay awake in the wagon that night, the river still roaring in his ears. He thought of the Sioux warriors' warning, of the dolls Sarah and Emma now clutched in their sleep, and of the black water carrying away the Petersons' supplies. The trail was teaching him something he wished he didn't have to learn. Sometimes survival wasn't about being stronger. It was about being spared. After the harrowing crossing of the North Platte, the wagon train moved forward with fewer supplies, frayed nerves, and oxen that looked as though they were ready to quit the journey altogether. Yet, despite it all, a strange thing began to creep back into camp. Laughter. It started small. One morning, Sarah and Emma tied strips of cloth to a prairie dog hole, claiming they were flags for Oregon. When the startled animal popped up, it snatched the cloth in its teeth and disappeared underground. Sarah squealed in triumph, declaring that even the prairie dogs supported their journey west. The grown-ups groaned, but the sound of giggles carried across the camp like music. Even Pa, grim-faced as ever, couldn't hide a chuckle. If prairie dogs are joining us, he said dryly, maybe they'll help pull the wagons. The oxen, overhearing, seemed less than amused. Humor found other ways to slip in too. During one particularly windy evening, Mr. Miller attempted to start the campfire. Each time he struck the flint, the spark landed, only for the gusting wind to snuff it out. Finally, in frustration, he stood up, shook his fist at the sky, and shouted, "If you think you can do better, Lord, then by all means light it yourself." A moment later, a flash of lightning split the clouds, striking the prairie half a mile away. The entire camp burst into laughter, even as the thunder rattled their bones. "Guess he heard you," Davidson muttered, shaking his head. But it wasn't all lighthearted. Hunger gnawed constantly. Supplies dwindled faster than anyone liked to admit. Meals became so repetitive that jokes about them became a form of survival. "What's for supper?" Thomas asked one night, staring at the bubbling pot. "Beans," Ma replied. "And tomorrow? Beans. And the day after that? Beans with beans." Even Pa cracked a grin at that. The truth was, monotony dulled the mind. The days blurred together. Up before dawn, hitch the oxen, walk beside the wagons until feet blistered, make camp, eat, sleep, repeat. The trail became less about grand adventure and more about finding reasons not to collapse in despair. Sometimes laughter was all they had left. Davidson understood this better than most. Though stern by nature, he surprised the children one evening by pulling out a harmonica. The tune was off-key, squeaky in parts, but Sarah clapped along and Emma danced a little jig in the firelight. Soon even the adults joined in. Mrs. Wilson's singing voice, long and used, filled the night with a hymn that blended beautifully with Davidson's clumsy melody. "Never thought I'd see the day our wagon master played a tune," Pa whispered to Thomas. Maybe he's human after all. The train pressed westward into rougher terrain. Hills rose, the trail cut into gullies where wheels threatened to snap, and the oxen strained harder each day. Tempers flared, then cooled in the strange rhythm of trail life. One afternoon, as the wagon struggled up a steep incline, Pa slipped in the mud and landed squarely in a cow pie. The sound, splat, was so loud and so perfect that for a moment the whole camp froze. Then Sarah exploded into laughter, doubled over, gasping for air. Emma followed, then Thomas, and soon even Ma had tears streaming down her cheeks. Pa glared, his face red as a beet. Glad to provide entertainment, he growled, peeling muck from his trousers. But later that night, Thomas caught him smirking to himself as he poked the fire. The humor never erased the hardships, but it softened the edges. Each laugh was like a stolen treasure, proof that misery hadn't won yet. Still, danger was never far. At the end of September, frost began to settle on the grass in the mornings. The oxen shivered in the cold, their ribs visible beneath patchy hides. The older folks muttered about early snows in the mountains, about passes that could close before they arrived. But in the evenings, after the fires were lit and bellies filled with yet more beans, the camp would gather close. Davidson sometimes told stories of his past crossings, most terrifying but occasionally absurd. "First train I ever led," he said one night, "a man brought along a piano. Swore his wife couldn't live without music. You ever seen 4 oxen try to haul a piano across a river? Things sank like a rock. We pulled the poor man out dripping wet, but he still tried to dive for it. Finally, I told him, if you want your piano, you can play it at the bottom of the Platte." The camp roared with laughter. Even the Petersons, still mourning their lost supplies, managed smiles. That night, as Thomas lay under the canvas cover, listening to Sarah whisper to her doll about Oregon's apple orchards, he realized something important. The trail wasn't just testing their bodies, it was testing their spirits. And the only way to endure was to keep laughing, even when everything else told them not to. The Black Hills faded behind them, and the trail returned to open country. But the land was not the same. The plains here were harsher, dry winds scoured the soil, and the horizon shimmered with heat even in late autumn. The wagon wheels groaned over ruts so deep they looked like scars carved by all the wagons that had come before. One afternoon, the sky began to change. Clouds boiled up in the west, dark and heavy, climbing higher by the hour. The air grew thick, the prairie unnervingly still. Even the oxen seemed to sense it, stamping nervously and tossing their heads. "Storm's coming," Davidson muttered, scanning the sky. "Circle the wagons. Tight." By the time camp was set, the clouds had rolled directly overhead. Lightning forked across the heavens, thunder cracking so loud it rattled the wagons. Rain came in torrents, sheets of water that flattened grass and turned the ground to soup. Within minutes, everything was soaked, blankets, food sacks, even the children huddled under wagons. Ma tried to shield Sarah and Emma with canvas, but water seeped through anyway, dripping cold down their necks. And then the wind came. It howled like a living thing, tearing at wagon covers, ripping hats from heads, toppling cooking pots into the mud. The oxen bellowed in panic. Men scrambled to secure ropes, shouting over the storm. Somehow, in the chaos, humor wormed its way in. When the Wilsons' tent blew clean off and tumbled across the prairie like a runaway tumbleweed, Mr. Wilson bellowed, "There goes our parlor. Guess the wind didn't like my wife's curtains either." Even as his family scrambled after their bedding, laughter rose from nearby wagons. Not to be outdone, old Mr. Johnson, who had insisted on carrying his fiddle wrapped in oilcloth, climbed onto his wagon and began to play. The screeching notes cut through the storm like a cat being strangled. "If we're going to drown," he shouted, "we might as well do it to music." The absurdity was so shocking that people actually laughed, huddled in the mud, their hair plastered to their faces, while lightning lit the prairie like day. But laughter didn't erase danger. A bolt struck not 100 yards from camp, setting dry grass aflame. Men rushed to stamp it out before the fire spread. Another struck closer, so bright Thomas swore he could see the bones in his hand through the flash. For a moment, the whole camp froze, waiting to see what might be taken. Miraculously, the wagons held. The fire died. The storm, after hours of fury, finally rolled east, leaving only a steady drizzle and a camp that looked like a battlefield. Children sloshed in mud up to their knees. Women wrung water from blankets, their faces lined with exhaustion. The oxen stood trembling, sides heaving, ropes hanging loose. "Beans for supper," Ma declared as she scraped mud from a pot, her voice so dry it nearly cracked. "Beans stew, beans soup, beans pudding," Thomas muttered. Sarah giggled, though her teeth chattered. "Beans cake for dessert?" The laughter spread again, thin but real, binding the weary travelers together. The next morning dawned gray, the ground still sodden. Wagons had to be pried from the mud with poles and sheer muscle. It took half the day to cover a single mile, wheels sinking deep with every turn. Pa slipped again in the muck, this time face first. He sat up slowly, mud dripping from his hair, his nose, even his ears. The camp went silent, waiting for his eruption. Instead, Pa sighed, wiped a hand across his filthy face and said, "Guess I'm part of the trail now." The entire Benton family doubled over with laughter. Even Davidson cracked a smile. But storms weren't always something to laugh at. That night, another wave swept over the plains, this one colder, sharper. Rain turned to sleet, rattling on wagon covers. By morning, the ground was crusted in ice. Oxen slipped and bellowed. Children's lips turned blue. Frost rimmed the edges of blankets. Davidson gathered the families around a sputtering fire. His face was grim. "We're close to Fort Bridger. Maybe 3-4 days if the weather holds. That's our last chance to resupply before the Blue Mountains. We push hard or we risk being caught in the snow." No one argued. The storm had stripped away any illusions. The trail was no longer about adventure. It was about survival. Still, that night, Thomas noticed something remarkable. Despite the cold, despite the fear, despite the endless misery, Sarah danced. She dragged Emma into the firelight, both of them stomping clumsily in the mud, giggling as they spun. Soon Mrs. Wilson joined, pulling her husband with her. Others followed until the camp was alive with music, clapping, and laughter. Thomas hesitated, shy as always, until Ma nudged him forward. "Go on, Thomas." After the storm, the prairie felt different, washed clean but scarred. Pools of water glittered in every depression, reflecting a pale sky. Wagons rolled slowly, wheels squelching in the mud with every turn. The oxen, ribs sharp beneath their hides, pulled with weary determination. 3 more days, Davidson reminded everyone each morning, though it felt more like a prayer than a certainty. Fort Bridger had become a beacon in every conversation, a place of shelter, food, medicine, a miracle waiting just ahead. But the trail did not give miracles freely. On the second day, one of the Jenkins oxen collapsed. It lay in the mud, eyes glassy, sides heaving. Mr. Jenkins knelt beside it, pleading, coaxing, even trying to haul it upright with ropes. Nothing worked. Finally, Davidson placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't save it. We move on." So they left the carcass by the trail, a grim offering to the circling wolves. The next morning, frost rimmed every blade of grass. Buckets froze solid. Sarah coughed so hard it doubled her over, and Ma spent precious minutes rubbing her back, whispering comfort. Emma pressed a doll into Sarah's hands, insisting it would protect her. "She survived the storm," Emma said solemnly. "She'll survive anything." Sarah managed a laugh, though it ended in a wheeze. The humor in camp turned increasingly dark. When Mr. Wilson slipped in the mud again and lost his last pair of dry socks in a puddle, he held up his bare feet and declared, "Guess I'll start a new fashion. Oregon barefoot chic." The children howled with laughter, even as Mrs. Wilson scolded him for catching cold. Even Pa found himself swept up in the absurdity. When a wagon wheel cracked on a rut, splintering into useless pieces, he leaned against it and sighed, "Well, I always wanted modern art. Look at that, it's practically a sculpture." Ma rolled her eyes, but Thomas caught the flicker of amusement at the corner of her mouth. By the third day, the land began to change. The endless plains gave way to rocky hills and scattered stands of pine. The air smelled sharper, cleaner, carrying the resin of evergreens. And then, rounding a bend, there it was, Fort Bridger. It wasn't the towering bastion anyone had imagined. Just a palisade of rough logs, barely higher than a man, surrounding a cluster of squat buildings. Smoke curled from chimneys. Horses grazed in a nearby pasture. A tattered American flag fluttered over the gate. The wagon train erupted in cheers. Even Davidson allowed himself a rare smile. Inside, chaos reigned. Dozens of other wagon trains had already arrived, their families crowding the cramped trading post. Traders shouted prices that made Pa sputter with disbelief. Flour, 3 times the cost at Fort Laramie. Coffee, practically gold dust. Bullets priced like jewels. Still, people paid. There was no choice. Pa traded 2 buffalo robes and Ma's silver brooch, a wedding gift from her mother, for a sack of flour and a little coffee. He tried to haggle, but the trader only smirked. "Don't like my price? Head back east. Plenty of supplies and independence." Pa muttered something under his breath that made Thomas bite back a laugh. The most precious currency wasn't food but information. Travelers heading east traded stories with those heading west. Snow already lay heavy in the Blue Mountains. The Columbia River ran high and dangerous with autumn rains. And most unsettling, bands of Cayuse Indians were said to be hostile, angered by the flood of wagons cutting through their land. That night, the family sat around the fort's courtyard fires, comparing notes. Some argued to stay the winter. Others insisted on pressing forward. Davidson's voice carried above the murmur. "The easy part is over. From here it's mountains, rivers, and snow. If anyone doubts their strength, better to stay now than die on the trail." Silence followed. No one from the Benton wagon stepped forward. Even the Jenkins family, shaken and weary, declared they would continue. "We've come this far," Mr. Jenkins said. "Might as well see it through." Later, as the firelight flickered against the fort walls, Pa spoke softly to Thomas. "You did good, son. Back at the river. With Emma. Not every boy would have jumped in. You're not a boy anymore. You're a man." The words struck deeper than the storm's cold. Thomas felt warmth spread in his chest, fierce and unexpected. That night, lying awake beneath the thin roof of the wagon, listening to the sounds of soldiers on watch and horses nickering in the dark, Thomas realized something. Oregon wasn't just a place anymore. It was a test, a crucible. And every mile pressed them harder, shaping them into something new. The next morning, the wagons rolled out of Fort Bridger. Smaller again, 4 families had chosen to winter in safety, but tighter, more determined. The trail ahead loomed dangerous, but the promise of Oregon still burned bright. And somewhere deep inside, Thomas almost welcomed the challenge. Almost. Leaving Fort Bridger behind, the wagon train rolled into a new kind of wilderness. Gone were the grassy plains and pine ridges. In their place stretched a high desert plateau, endless waves of sagebrush and bitter greasewood under a sky so vast it seemed to press down on them. The land was dust and silence. Even the wind carried no relief, only grit that worked its way into teeth, hair, and blankets. The sun glared fiercely during the day, baking the ground until it cracked. At night, the temperature plunged, frost forming on the wagons before dawn. "This place don't want us here," Pa muttered, squinting across the barren horizon. Davidson kept the pace brisk, urging everyone toward the Snake River, the next reliable water source. 3 days if we push," he said. 4 if the oxen hold." But water was scarce, and each mile stretched longer than the last. Springs marked on the map were either dry or so alkaline they left the oxen retching and weak. Families rationed their barrels carefully, doling out sips instead of gulps. Children cried for more, only to be hushed with bitter willow tea. Sarah's cough worsened in the dry air. Ma boiled more bark, whispering encouragement as Sarah grimaced and swallowed. Emma tried to distract her with stories, claiming the sagebrush were really tiny forests for ants who built kingdoms underground. One night, around a smoky fire fueled by greasewood, Mr. Wilson tried to lighten the mood. He raised his tin cup, filled with barely half a measure of water, and declared, "To the fine wines of the desert." Notes of dust, with a finish of despair. Laughter rippled through the circle, though thin and weary. Old Mr. Johnson, never to be outdone, lifted his own cup and added, "I'd kill for a drop of vinegar. At least it'd have some flavor." Even Davidson cracked a reluctant smile. Humor had become a shield, as vital as rifles or rations. The desert tested more than thirst. Food dwindled rapidly. Hunting parties returned empty-handed, reporting nothing but lizards and jackrabbits too lean to bother with. The oxen grew gaunt, their hips jutting sharp. Families began dipping into their seed corn, meant for planting in Oregon, boiling it into thin gruel. Every bite tasted like sacrifice. On the second day out from Fort Bridger, disaster struck. The Miller wagon axle, already weak, snapped on a rocky incline. The family scrambled to unload their supplies before the wagon tipped completely. Pa and Thomas rushed to help, binding the axle with strips of rawhide and salvaged iron. "It'll hold till Oregon," Pa said, though Thomas could see the doubt in his eyes. By late afternoon, dust storms became a new enemy. The horizon darkened, not with rain but with walls of swirling grit. The wind rose to a shriek, driving sand into eyes and mouths, scouring the skin raw. Wagons halted, canvas covers lashed down tight. Families huddled inside, coughing and praying the storm would pass. When it did, the world looked changed. Wagons half buried, oxen trembling, faces streaked with grime. Yet somehow people laughed. Mrs. Wilson emerged from her wagon, her hair sticking straight up with static from the storm. She threw her arms wide and declared, "Well, that's the worst beauty parlor I've ever been to." The camp erupted in laughter, loud and cathartic, echoing across the barren plain. That night, the stars blazed so clear and sharp it hurt to look at them. Thomas lay awake, staring upward, listening to the oxen shifting restlessly. Pa joined him, handing over the last piece of dried meat. "Chew slow," he advised. "It's got to last you." "Think Oregon's really like they say?" Thomas asked quietly. Pa didn't answer right away. The fire crackled, a thin line of warmth in the vast cold. Finally he said, "It better be, son. Or else this desert is the cruelest joke ever told." By the third day, hope came in the form of water. The Snake River appeared suddenly, gleaming in the sunlight as the wagons descended from the high plateau into a canyon. The sight drew cheers and tears alike. Oxen stumbled toward it, their tongues lolling. Children raced ahead, only to be stopped short by Davidson's sharp command. "Careful. Too much too fast will kill them." The first drink was measured, but the relief was undeniable. For the first time in days, bellies were full of clear, sweet water. Barrels were replenished. Faces were washed clean of grit. Even the oxen, ribs still sharp, seemed steadier. That night, camped beside the river, music rose again. Mr. Johnson played his fiddle, this time with notes almost tender. Families sang softly, voices carried by the canyon walls. Sarah leaned against Thomas, her cough momentarily stilled. "It feels alive here," she whispered. Thomas nodded. The desert was behind them, for now. The Snake River promised a way forward. But even as laughter rose in camp, the dark outline of the Blue Mountains loomed faintly in the distance, capped with snow. The real test still waited. The Snake River seemed like salvation at first. Water clear and plentiful, forage along its banks richer than anything the wagons had seen in weeks. But as the train followed it northwest, the river revealed its darker nature. The canyon walls closed in, towering cliffs of volcanic rock rising on one side, the river itself churning fast on the other. The trail narrowed to little more than a ledge, just wide enough for a wagon. One slip of a wheel and everything, wagon, oxen, family, would tumble straight into the boiling current below. Davidson ordered single file, with the strongest wagons in front to set the pace. "Check your brakes at every stop," he barked. "Chains on the wheels. Keep your oxen steady." Thomas walked beside his family's wagon, hand brushing the rough cliff wall as if that touch alone could steady it. Below, the snake hissed and foamed, white water pounding against jagged rocks. Sarah peeked out from under the canvas cover, wide-eyed. "If we fall, will we float all the way to Oregon?" Ma hushed her, though Thomas caught Pa's faint smile. "Let's stick to the road, Squirt," Pa said. "Floating's faster, but bumpier." The tension along the ledge was so thick it almost strangled the camp. People whispered prayers, mothers held children tight, men checked ropes and chains again and again. But as always, humor found cracks to sneak through. When Mr. Wilson's hat blew off and landed on a rock far below, he stared after it in mournful silence. "There goes the finest coonskin hat west of the Mississippi. Guess I'll be scalped by the sun instead." "Don't worry," Mrs. Wilson shot back. "It'll improve your looks." Laughter, nervous but real, broke the canyon's hush. The danger wasn't just cliffs. The river itself sometimes flooded the path, forcing wagons to inch through water that lapped at their hubs. Oxen stumbled, men pushed at wheels that threatened to slide sideways. More than once, Thomas thought the wagon would tip. His arms ached from bracing, his boots soaked through. One afternoon, disaster struck. The Harris wagon, heavy with supplies, hit a patch of loose rock. The wheels skidded, then slipped over the edge. For a frozen moment, the whole wagon teetered, oxen bellowing in panic. "Ropes?" Davidson shouted. Men flung lines around the wagon frame, bracing with their full weight. Oxen strained, hooves scrabbling. With a groan like a dying beast, the wagon tilted back onto the path. Cheers echoed through the canyon, though Thomas's knees trembled so badly he could barely stand. That night, around the fire, Mr. Harris tried to make light of it. "Well," he said, voice still shaky, "guess the snake wanted my wife's biscuits more than I did." His wife smacked his shoulder, but the laughter that followed eased the fear in everyone's chest. Still, the canyon wore them down. Progress was slow, barely 10 miles a day. The cliffs funneled cold winds that cut through blankets at night. Fires smoked and sputtered in the damp air. Children coughed, their voices echoing eerily off stone walls. And yet, beauty shone through the hardship. Waterfalls spilled from the cliffs, silver ribbons plunging hundreds of feet into the river. Eagles wheeled high overhead, their cries sharp against the wind. Sometimes, when the sun broke through, the canyon glowed golden, every rock seeming to shine. One evening, the Johnson fiddle appeared again. This time, instead of a lively tune, he played something soft, almost mournful. The sound drifted upward, swallowed by cliffs, carried downriver by the wind. Families listened in silence, some with tears glistening in firelight. Emma, still weak but recovering, whispered to Sarah, "That music sounds like the river singing back." Sarah nodded solemnly. "Then it's a sad song. The river misses everyone it swallowed." The words chilled Thomas more than the night air. He thought of the Harris wagon, of the hat lost to the current, of countless wagons abandoned along the trail. The snake was not a friend. It was a rival, a reminder that every mile forward was borrowed, not earned. After a week of grinding progress, the canyon finally widened. The path broadened, the cliffs drew back, and the wagon train emerged into open country once more. The relief was so strong it rippled through the camp like a wave. Children ran in circles, oxen grazed freely, and adults stretched their arms toward the sky as if they'd been released from prison. Pa clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Well, son, looks like we cheated the snake after all." Thomas nodded, though he glanced back at the dark canyon behind them. Cheated, yes. But the river would have its victories. Everyone knew it. The next landmark loomed ahead, Fort Hall. Another chance to resupply, another flicker of civilization in the wilderness. But rumors carried downriver spoke of snow in the Blue Mountains, heavy and early. The wagons rolled on, laughter thinner now, replaced by grim determination. The canyon had tested them. The mountains would judge them. The sight of Fort Hall brought tears to more than one pair of eyes. After the narrow ledges of the Snake River Canyon, the small outpost seemed like a miracle. Rough log walls, a handful of sturdy buildings, and the American flag flapping above it. Civilization, however fragile, in the midst of wilderness. As the wagons pulled in, soldiers in blue jackets came out to greet them, guiding oxen to corrals and directing families toward trading stalls. The fort wasn't large, but compared to weeks of dust and cliffs, it felt like a palace. Inside, chaos reigned. Families from half a dozen wagon trains crowded every corner, haggling, begging, trading for food and medicine. Prices were outrageous. A pound of flour cost more than Pa's boots were worth. Coffee was sold by the spoonful, not the sack. Still, people paid. Starvation didn't care about coin. Pa muttered curses under his breath as he handed over a gold coin he'd hidden in his boot since independence. "Highway robbery," he growled, clutching a precious bag of ammunition. "But I'll be damned if we face the Blue Mountains with empty rifles." Ma traded the last of her honey and a tin brooch for dried beans and a pouch of wild cherry bark syrup. She pressed the syrup into Thomas's hands. "For Sarah. Doctor here says it's the best he's got." The real treasure, though, was news. At night, gathered around fires in the fort's common yard, families traded stories. And the stories weren't good. Early snows had already fallen in the Blue Mountains. The Columbia River was swollen with autumn rains, running fast and cold. Worse, reports spread of Cayuse bands turning hostile. A wagon train just days ahead had been harassed, their livestock driven off, their men forced to stand guard all night with rifles in hand. Davidson listened quietly, then stood before the gathered families. His voice was blunt, hard as flint. "From here, there's no turning back. We either push forward or winter here. But supplies are scarce, and winter in these parts will kill as surely as snow in the mountains." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I plan to push forward. To the Dalles before the passes close. But each family must choose for themselves." The decision tore through camp like fire through dry grass. Some were too weary to continue, their children sick or their animals near death. They would winter at Fort Hall, gambling on survival until spring. Others, hardened by the miles, insisted they would not stop until Oregon. The Bentons chose to go on. Pa's voice was steady but tired. We've come too far to sit in a shack and freeze. Oregon's ahead, and that's where we're going. Sarah managed a weak cheer, though her cough rattled her chest. Emma pressed the buckskin doll into her hand, whispering, "It'll keep you safe." Even amid grim news, humor refused to die. When Mr. Wilson learned the price of bacon, he nearly fainted. "For that much, the pig better march itself to Oregon and build me a cabin," he declared. His wife smacked his arm, but laughter spread through the weary families. Old Mr. Johnson, never missing a chance, added, "If the pigs are that clever, maybe they'll play my fiddle too." The camp roared with laughter, loud enough to make soldiers peek over the palisade wall. For a brief moment, the Oregon Trail felt less like a death march and more like a traveling circus. But the weight of truth pressed in. The mountains loomed westward, their peaks already white, glinting under the autumn sun. And winter waited in their shadows. On their second night at Fort Hall, Thomas wandered to the edge of camp. The stars blazed overhead, sharper than he'd ever seen. Pa joined him, silent at first, then spoke. "Funny thing," Pa said, his breath clouding in the cold. "I used to think Oregon was about land. Rich soil, room to spread. Now I think it's about surviving long enough to see it." Thomas swallowed hard. "Do you think we'll make it?" Pa rested a hand on his shoulder, rough and calloused. "We'll make it. Because we have to. No one else is going to do it for us." The next morning, wagons rolled out of Fort Hall. Smaller again. Families too weak to continue stayed behind, faces pale as they waved farewell. The Benton wagon creaked onto the trail, Sarah coughing softly, Ma watching her with worried eyes, Pa grim as stone. Ahead stretched the high plateau, and beyond that, the jagged teeth of the Blue Mountains. For the first time, Thomas truly understood. Every mile west was not just a step toward Oregon. It was a gamble with winter itself. And the stakes were everything. The land west of Fort Hall felt different, as if it were bracing itself to fight them. The trail climbed steadily, the earth turning from dusty plateau to sharp volcanic rock, black and jagged like broken glass. Sagebrush gave way to scattered pines, their resinous scent sharp in the cold air. And beyond, always looming, were the Blue Mountains, jagged peaks rising like walls against the horizon, their upper slopes already crowned in white. The first flakes of snow fell 3 days out. Just a light dusting at dawn, melting by noon, but enough to send a shiver through camp. Everyone knew it was a warning. "Too early," Pa muttered as he rubbed down the oxen. "Snow like this should come in November. Not now." By the end of the week, it was no longer just flurries. Heavy, wet snow blanketed the trail, slowing progress to a crawl. Oxen strained, their hooves sinking deep. Wagons slid sideways, chains groaning as wheels locked against steep descents. Every hill became a battle. Thomas walked with his head down, boots crunching, breath steaming in the icy air. The mountains towered above them, silent and merciless. At camp, exhaustion hung over everyone. Fires smoked in the damp wood, blankets froze stiff overnight. Meals shrank again, beans stretched with snowmelt, flour rationed to the ounce. The younger children whined with hunger until their parents silenced them with lullabies instead of food. Still, humor found cracks to crawl through. One night, as snow drifted down onto a miserable stew, Mr. Wilson peered into his tin cup and declared, "Beans with ice. A new delicacy. Someday they'll serve it in fine restaurants." Laughter rippled through the camp, though Ma only rolled her eyes. "If you ever open a restaurant, Wilson, I'll make sure no one eats there." "Not even for free snow on top?" he shot back, grinning through chattering teeth. But no one laughed when the Petersons lost a wagon. Halfway up a steep incline, the wheels slipped on ice. The oxen stumbled, ropes snapped, and the whole load tumbled backward into a ravine. Supplies, tools, even family keepsakes, gone in seconds. By some miracle, no one was killed, but the family stood weeping on the ridge, staring at the wreckage below. The Benton family helped as best they could. Pa offered a share of flour, Ma gave up a blanket, and Thomas pressed half of his jerky into the Peterson boy's hand. But everyone knew the truth. Each loss made survival less certain for all. That night, Davidson called a meeting. Snow fell thick, coating his shoulders as he spoke. "We push on tomorrow no matter what. If we stop, we die here. The pass must be crossed before the storms close it for good. No one argued. The next morning, the train moved like an army of ghosts, bent against the wind. The snow deepened, sometimes waist-high, forcing men to break trail with shovels and axes. Oxen collapsed in the drifts, and more than once, whole teams had to be dug out before the train could move forward again. Thomas's arms ached, his lungs burned, but he kept on, driven by Pa's quiet, steady voice. "Step, boy. One more step. That's all it is. Just one more." By the 5th day in the mountains, spirits sagged. Frostbite nipped at fingers and toes. Children coughed blood. The Jenkins wagon nearly froze in place when the family's oxen refused to rise. It took half the men in camp, shouting and whipping, to drag the beasts to their feet. That night, even Mr. Johnson's fiddle could not cheer them. The bow squeaked on frozen strings, producing a noise so pitiful that someone muttered, "Sounds like the oxen dying." No one laughed. But the next morning, when Pa slipped on ice and landed squarely in a snowdrift, arms flailing like a stranded beetle, laughter returned. Even Ma chuckled as Thomas helped haul him up. "Glad to see you're enjoying yourself," Pa muttered, brushing snow from his beard. "Best entertainment we've had all week," Ma said dryly, and for once, the whole family laughed together, even Sarah through her cough. It was a thin light, but it mattered. At last, after what felt like an eternity of snow and stone, the wagon train reached the highest ridge. The world opened below them, a vast forested slope stretching westward, the promise of Oregon hidden beyond. Davidson raised his arm, voice carrying over the wind. "This is the pass. We've crossed the divide. From here, the trail goes down." Cheers rose weakly, muffled by scarves and fatigue. The descent would be dangerous, perhaps deadlier than the climb, but for the first time in days, hope flickered again. Thomas stood at the ridge, snow stinging his face, and looked west. The land still seemed endless, wild, merciless. But beneath the fear, he felt something stronger, a stubborn fire that refused to die. They had made it this far. They would make it farther. Snow fell without end. Morning, noon, night, it poured from the sky in heavy, wet flakes that clung to wagons, froze on blankets, and buried the oxen up to their bellies. The trail disappeared beneath white drifts. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes no more than a mile in a whole day. Thomas's legs ached from trudging through knee-deep snow. His boots were never dry, his toes numb most of the time. Pa's voice stayed steady, though his face was grim. "Keep moving, son. One step, then another." But even Pa couldn't hide the truth. The mountains were winning. At night, the wagon circle looked more like a siege camp than a settlement. Fires hissed weakly against the snow, smoke rising into a gray sky. Children huddled under every blanket, coughing and shivering. The oxen stood with heads low, ribs visible, chewing whatever sparse forage could be dug from beneath the drifts. Sarah grew weaker each day. Her cough rattled in the thin air, her face pale and drawn. Ma pressed cherry bark syrup to her lips, whispering encouragement, but Thomas saw the worry etched deep in her eyes. Emma sat close, holding Sarah's hand, telling her stories of the orchard they'd plant in Oregon. Still, humor poked its head through the snowdrifts. When Mr. Wilson fell face first into a snowbank and came up with a white beard of frost, he spread his arms wide and shouted, "Look at me! St. Nicholas himself, come early." The children giggled despite their misery, and even Pa cracked a smile. Old Mr. Johnson tried to play his fiddle, but the cold had stiffened the strings so badly the sound came out as a pitiful squeak. He scowled, then declared, "Fine. It's a snow fiddle now. Only plays winter songs." The camp laughed, and for a few moments the cold felt less sharp. But the laughter faded quickly when the Peterson wagon broke down. The axle snapped, and with no wood left for repairs, the family had no choice but to abandon it. They piled what supplies they could onto other wagons, but much was left behind. Tools, clothes, even the cradle that had carried their youngest. Mrs. Peterson wept as the wagon lay half buried in snow, a monument to loss. That night, Davidson called a council. His face was stern, but his voice shook with the weight of the decision. "We can't go on like this. At this pace, we'll be trapped here all winter. The only chance is to split the train." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, fearful and uncertain. "The strongest wagons, the healthiest oxen, the hardiest among us. We push ahead. Break trail. If we reach the Dalles, we'll send help back. The rest..." Davidson paused, glancing around at the weary faces. The rest will stay winter in place and pray for survival. The words hit like a hammer. Families looked at one another, torn between dread and desperate hope. The Jenkins decided to split, Mr. Jenkins and his oldest boy pushing ahead, while Mrs. Jenkins stayed behind with Emma and the younger children. The Millers, still strong, declared they'd go forward. The Wilsons, with sick children, had no choice but to stay. The Benton family faced their own agonizing debate. Sarah was too weak to travel fast, but splitting meant leaving her behind. "We stay together," Pa said finally, voice firm as iron. "Whatever happens, we face it as a family." Ma's eyes glistened, but she nodded. Together. Thomas felt relief and fear in equal measure. Relief that Sarah wouldn't be left, fear that staying meant dying. The next morning the split came. 37 wagons pushed ahead into the snow, the sound of their wheels creaking away like a farewell. 22 wagons remained behind, forming a winter camp in a sheltered valley. The departure was silent, somber. No cheers, no fiddle, only murmured prayers and promises. "We'll send help," Davidson vowed before disappearing into the swirling white. Those who stayed began the grim work of building winter shelters. Wagons were drawn close, canvas stretched between them. Pine boughs were cut to make lean-tos. Fires were stoked with the last of the dry wood. Men organized hunting parties, though game was scarce. The Benton wagon became a sick room for Sarah, her breathing shallow, Ma's hand never leaving her forehead. Emma sat close, whispering promises of apple orchards and warm summers. At night the wolves came. Their howls echoed through the valley, hungry and sharp. 2 oxen were taken before armed watch was established. Thomas lay awake, staring at the frost forming on the wagon cover, wondering if Davidson would make it to the Dalles, if help would come, if Oregon was anything more than a cruel dream. Yet even in the bleakest moment, humor clung stubbornly. When Pa slipped in the snow while chopping wood and ended up flat on his back, he groaned, "This mountain's trying to bury me early." Ma smirked, brushing snow from his coat. "Not yet. I need you to fetch more firewood first." The camp chuckled, thin but real. And in that laughter, Thomas felt a flicker of warmth against the cold that no snow could smother. The departure of Davidson and the advance party left a silence heavier than the snow itself. The valley seemed to swallow sound. No fiddle music. No chatter of children running between wagons. Just the crunch of boots on snow and the distant, haunting echo of wolves. The Benton family, like 21 others, remained behind. The winter camp took shape out of necessity. Wagons were drawn into a tight circle, canvas stretched to form crude communal shelters. Pine boughs became walls and bedding. Fires were kept burning day and night, though the smoke stung eyes and lungs. Food became the single obsession. Breakfast shrank to thin gruel, cornmeal boiled in snow water, flavored with the faintest scrape of salt pork. Dinner was a spoonful of beans or a sliver of dried meat. Children were given slightly larger portions, but even they complained of hunger constantly. Sarah's cough deepened, rattling her thin chest. Ma rarely left her side. "Keep sipping," she whispered, spooning willow bark tea past Sarah's cracked lips. Thomas watched helplessly, wishing he could trade places. But despair never fully claimed the camp. Humor had a way of slipping in like sparks in the ash. One morning, as the men dug through drifts to reach the frozen creek, Mr. Johnson emerged carrying a bucket of ice, his beard frosted stiff. "Found us some water," he declared, "just a little crunchy." The camp laughed, even as they melted the ice down for drinking. At night, when the wolves howled closest, children clung to their mothers. Old Mrs. Jenkins, her eyes twinkling despite exhaustion, muttered, "They're just singing to the moon because their fiddler plays worse than ours." The tension broke and nervous giggles filled the circle. Hunting parties brought back what they could. Rabbits thin as kindling, and occasional deer that provided meat for a week. Once, a skunk was trapped. The meat was foul, but nobody complained after tasting something different from beans. Pa joked, "That critter died twice, once in the trap, then again on the fire." The wolves circled Boulder as food grew scarce. 2 oxen were taken before armed watches drove them back with rifle fire. The loss of animals cut deep. Each ox meant hundreds of pounds less supplies hauled come spring. Still, Pa kept his rifle close, eyes sharp. Snow piled deeper with each storm. Wagons half buried, canvas sagging with weight. The children carved tunnels between shelters, turning hardship into a game. "Look," Sarah rasped one day, her fever briefly eased. We made a castle. For a moment, she sounded like the little sister Thomas remembered from Missouri, full of mischief instead of sickness. Even the adults joined in. Mr. Wilson crawled through one tunnel only to get stuck halfway. His legs flailed in the snow until the children tugged him free, roaring with laughter. "Guess I'm not castle-sized," he wheezed, brushing off snow. For the first time in weeks, Thomas laughed until his sides hurt. But every evening the reality returned. Graves marked the edges of camp. 3 children, 2 elders. The frozen ground was too hard to dig deep, so crosses of wagonwood stood above shallow mounds. Each death etched fear deeper into every face. One night, Pa spoke quietly while mending a harness. "This is a test, Thomas. Winter's trying to see if we'll bend or break." Thomas swallowed hard. "And if we break? Then the trail wins," Pa said simply. He looked Thomas straight in the eye. "But we're Bentons. We don't break easy." The long wait stretched on. Days blurred into a rhythm of digging snow, cutting wood, tending fires, rationing food. The calendar meant little. Only the sky and the gnaw of hunger marked time. Then, on the 15th morning, a shout rang through camp. "Riders!" Everyone who could move rushed to the edge of the valley. Through falling snow, a group of horsemen emerged, 10 men leading pack mules. At their head rode John Miller, face gaunt but triumphant. "We made it to the Dalles," he shouted, his voice carrying hope like fire. "Davidson sent us with supplies." Cheers erupted, weak but genuine. Relief washed over the camp. Men clapped backs, women wept, children cheered. For the first time in weeks, survival felt possible. The supplies, flour, dried meat, medicine, were rationed carefully. They weren't enough for everyone to travel yet, but the sickest would be evacuated first. Sarah was chosen. Wrapped in every blanket available, she whispered to Thomas as she was lifted onto a mule, "See you in Oregon." The camp felt smaller without her, but lighter too. Davidson's promise of help was real. Hope had returned, carried on horseback through snow and despair. That night, as Thomas lay by the fire, he realized something. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a road. It was a crucible, burning away weakness, forging strength. And though winter pressed hard, the spirit of the camp refused to break. The riders brought life back into the winter camp. Their arrival was like a second sunrise in the middle of the snowbound valley. John Miller dismounted stiffly, his beard rimed with frost, but his grin lit the camp like a lantern. "We made it to the Dalles," he said, voice hoarse. "Davidson sent us back with food, medicine, and news." The news spread quickly. The advance party had fought its way through the Blue Mountains, battered but alive. Wagons were lost, a man froze on night watch, yet most had reached safety. Davidson wasted no time sending relief, knowing every hour counted for those trapped behind. The supplies were laid out in the center of camp. Flour, dried meat, coffee, salt. Not much, but enough. Children crowded close, eyes wide at the sight of food more plentiful than they'd seen in weeks. "Step back," Davidson's men ordered, though gently. "Everyone gets their share." Sarah was chosen among the sick to be evacuated immediately. Wrapped in every blanket Ma could spare, she managed a faint smile. "See you in Oregon," she whispered to Thomas before being lifted onto a mule. Ma went with her. "You take care of your pa," she told Thomas fiercely, kissing his forehead. "And yourself." Then they were gone, riding west with the relief party, leaving the camp strangely hollow. Life resumed, but lighter somehow. The promise of Oregon no longer felt like a fading dream. Help had come once. More would follow. Pa grew sterner though. "We've been spared, Thomas, but this isn't over. Every ounce of food, every nail, every breath matters now." The work intensified. Wagons were stripped to essentials. Tools, weapons, food, a few precious keepsakes. Everything else was abandoned in a pile at the center of camp. Chairs, trunks, even a spinning wheel. Mrs. Wilson wept as she left her mother's quilt behind, but Pa only said quietly, "Better sorrow than starvation." Humored, though refused to die. When Mr. Johnson tried to patch a wagon wheel with strips of frozen bacon, he shrugged at the laughter. "Well, if it breaks, at least we can eat it." Old Mrs. Jenkins declared she would haunt anyone who touched her jar of pickles. "Don't matter if I starve," she rasped. "Those pickles are going to Oregon." The children invented games in the snow. Tunnel races, snowball wars, even a contest to see who could make the funniest snowman. One figure wore Pa's old hat for a crown, its arms made of frozen ox bones. "Meet King Oregon," Thomas announced, bowing with mock solemnity. The camp laughed, and for a moment the snow felt less heavy. Days passed. Hunting brought little hares lean as twigs, one scrawny deer shared among a dozen families. The wolves still circled at night, their howls echoing through the valley. But the fresh supplies stretched further than anyone dared hope. Then one morning another shout rose, "Riders! More riders!" This time it was Davidson himself, arriving with 15 men and more supplies. His face was weathered, but his eyes burned with determination. "Time to move," he said without preamble. "The weather's holding. The trail's as clear as it'll get. Pack only what you need. The rest stays." The camp buzzed with frantic energy. Wagons were stripped further, families forced to decide what pieces of their old lives mattered most. A Bible here, a locket there, a child's rag doll tucked safely beneath blankets. Everything else was left behind, piled high in the snow. Thomas stood with Pa, staring at their wagon now half empty. "Feels like leaving ourselves behind," he muttered. Pa's jaw tightened. "Better to lose things than lives. Oregon will give us new ones." Departure came at dawn. 17 wagons rolled out of the valley, leaving 5 families who chose to winter in place. Their goodbyes were quiet, filled with promises of spring reunions that none truly believed. The trail ahead was brutal. Snow waist-deep in places, the path barely discernible even with flags left by the advance party. Men shoveled and hacked at drifts while oxen strained against harnesses. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. The nights were colder than anything Thomas had ever imagined. Fires sputtered in the wind. Fingers froze to metal. Even laughter froze quickly, but people found reasons to use it anyway. When a mule refused to move, Mr. Wilson leaned close and whispered, "I promise you a full bucket of whiskey in Oregon." The camp chuckled as the mule lurched forward, almost as if it understood. Pa shook his head. "Whiskey's too precious for mules." But the smile on his face told Thomas the joke had served its purpose. By the third day they reached the highest pass of the Blue Mountains. The wind howled like a living beast, tearing at canvas and coats, driving snow into every crevice. Wagons creaked and groaned as chains locked wheels for the descent. Men held ropes on either side, straining to keep wagons from toppling into ravines. Every step was terror. One slip could mean death. But somehow, miraculously, all 17 wagons reached the forest below. Fires blazed that night higher than ever, warming frozen hands, hearts, and spirits. Davidson stood before the camp, his voice carrying above the crackle of flames. "Worst is behind us. 3 more days and we'll reach the Dalles. From there, Oregon waits." Cheers rose, hoarse but heartfelt. Thomas sat beside Pa, watching sparks rise into the black sky. His muscles ached, his stomach growled, but hope, real hope, burned in his chest. For the first time in months, Oregon no longer seemed like a dream. It was close, tangible, almost within reach. The worst of the Blue Mountains lay behind them, but the descent toward the Dalles was no gentle stroll. The trail wound steeply down through forests of towering pines and slick ravines carved by rushing meltwater. Each switchback tested both wagon and oxen. "Chains tight," Davidson barked every morning. "Keep men on the ropes." The wagons creaked and groaned as iron chains locked their wheels. Men strained at ropes tied to the sides, keeping the loads from sliding off the path and tumbling into the abyss below. Thomas's arms burned with effort, but he welcomed the ache. It was proof he still lived. At times, the trail narrowed so much that wagons passed within inches of sheer drop-offs. Children were ordered to walk in single file, hands clasped tight with parents. The silence of those passages was broken only by the squeal of wood, the grunt of oxen, and the low prayers muttered under breath. Yet humor, stubborn as ever, found its place. When Mr. Wilson slipped in the mud and slid 10 feet downhill on his backside, he popped up covered in brown slime and declared, "Trail's smoother this way." The camp burst into laughter, even as they helped drag him back up. Old Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "If we get to Oregon with that man still in one piece, it'll be the Lord's biggest miracle." Food remained scarce, but the forest offered small blessings. Rabbits darted across paths, birds flushed from the trees. Once, Pa returned from a hunting party with a wild turkey slung over his shoulder. "Christmas come early," he announced. That night, the camp feasted, grease dripping down fingers, laughter echoing in the pines. Still, winter pressed close. The cold gnawed at bones. Snow lingered on the higher slopes, though here at lower elevation, it melted into slick mud. The oxen stumbled often, their ribs stark under hides. More than one collapsed mid-trail, forcing families to abandon wagons or redistribute loads. The Peterson family lost their last ox outside a narrow canyon. With no animals left to pull, they faced ruin. Davidson was blunt. "We can't haul an empty wagon and starving mouths." But Pa stepped forward. "We'll take the children." Others followed. One family offered space for flour, another for tools. Piece by piece, the Petersons' lives were divided among neighbors. Their wagon, stripped bare, was left behind, a skeleton of wood and iron in the mud. That night, the Peterson father sat silent by the fire, staring at the flames. Then, with a rough laugh, he said, "Well, guess I always wanted to travel light." The camp chuckled, though the humor was edged with sorrow. The days blurred into a relentless march downhill. Morning began before dawn with fires coaxed from damp wood, frozen fingers fumbling with harnesses. By dusk, bodies sagged with exhaustion, eyes burning from smoke and fatigue. Yet hope grew stronger. Every mile west meant warmer air, greener valleys. The promise of the Dalles pulled them onward. On the 5th day of descent, scouts returned with news. The Columbia River. "We saw it from the ridge." A cheer rippled through the camp. The Columbia was the last great barrier, the river that would carry them west to the Willamette Valley. Its name was whispered like salvation, though none forgot its dangers. Rapids, cold water, treacherous currents. But it meant Oregon was close. That evening, the camp allowed itself rare celebration. Someone produced the fiddle, its strings loosened from the cold but still able to sing. "Play us home," a voice called. The music rose, thin but defiant. Families danced around fires, boots stomping mud, laughter chasing away the chill. Pa even tried a jig, though his stiff legs made it more of a shuffle. Ma laughed so hard she nearly fell into the fire. For a few hours, the trail's misery was forgotten. Later, Thomas sat with Emma and Sarah, still thin but stronger after her time with the relief party. The girls clutched their buckskin dolls, whispering plans for the orchard they'd plant in Oregon. Apples, cherries, even peaches. "And strawberries," Sarah added firmly. Thomas smiled at their dreaming. Maybe it would all come true. Maybe Oregon really was a land where families could start anew, where hardship gave way to abundance. As dawn broke the next day, the wagon train crested a ridge and gasps filled the air. Below stretched the Columbia River, vast and glittering, flowing westward like a road of silver. Beyond it, faint but visible, lay the green folds of the Willamette Valley. Pa's hand gripped Thomas's shoulder. His voice was hoarse but filled with awe. "Almost there, son. Almost there." For the first time since leaving Missouri, Thomas felt certain. They would make it. The Columbia River was beautiful, but no one mistook it for gentle. From the ridge, it looked calm, gleaming silver under winter light. Up close, it roared like an angry beast, frothing white where rocks split the current. Rapids thundered in narrow gorges. This river was no road, it was a gauntlet. Davidson gathered the families. "Two choices," he said. "The Barlow Road over the Cascades or the river. The road's already buried in snow. The river's dangerous, but it flows downhill, and downhill is where Oregon lies." No one argued. Snowbound mountains meant certain death. The river, at least, gave them a fighting chance. Work began at once. The wagons were dismantled. Wheels stacked. Axles bound together. Wooden planks lashed tight. Local guides, rough frontiersmen who lived off the land, helped design the rafts. 20 feet long, 10 wide, with raised sides to keep water out. A giant oar at the stern for steering. Crude shelters of canvas were rigged in the center. Thomas marveled at the transformation. Wagons that had carried families across 2,000 miles were reborn as boats. Pa muttered, "Never thought I'd trust our lives to something that looks like a pile of firewood." But his hands worked steady, tying knots, sealing seams with pitch. The oxen couldn't ride the rafts. Hired drivers, men hard as nails, promised to drive them over the Barlow Road and meet them in the valley. Families said quick, tearful goodbyes to the animals that had hauled their dreams across the plains. When the first raft slid into the Columbia, the entire camp held its breath. The current caught it instantly, spinning it sideways. Shouts rang out as the stern oar dug deep, fighting to straighten it. For a moment, it looked certain to capsize, but then, miraculously, it steadied, riding low but firm. A ragged cheer went up. The Benton family boarded their raft the next morning. Pa stood at the stern, hands gripping the oar. Ma kept Sarah and Emma in the shelter, their buckskin dolls tucked under blankets. Thomas crouched near the bow, watching the water foam around rocks. His stomach churned, part fear, part excitement. "Hold on tight," Pa warned as the raft lurched into motion. The river swept them forward, faster than any oxen could ever walk. Cliffs towered on either side, waterfalls plunging hundreds of feet into the gorge. It was breathtaking, until the first rapids appeared. "Left," a guide shouted from a nearby raft. Pa heaved the oar, muscles straining. The raft shuddered as waves slapped its sides, water spraying into faces. Sarah shrieked, clutching Ma's skirt. Thomas dug his fingers into the planks, certain they'd flip. Then just as suddenly they were through, spinning out into calmer water. The camp cheered across the river, voices echoing off canyon walls. One raft hadn't been so lucky though. The Wilsons' vessel struck a rock and spun, half their cargo washing overboard. Men leapt from other rafts to help, throwing ropes, dragging the family back aboard. No lives lost, but flour, tools, and blankets were swallowed by the Columbia. That night, camp was made on a narrow bank. Fires flickered against the cliffs, the roar of rapids never far away. Families wrung out wet clothes and checked cargo. The Wilsons sat huddled, shivering but alive. "Lost half our beans," Mr. Wilson said bitterly. Mrs. Wilson sighed, then tried a smile. "At least we still have the pickles." That drew a laugh from the camp, weary but genuine. Even tragedy couldn't quite smother humor. The second day brought calmer stretches, but new dangers. Fog rolled through the gorge, blinding the rafts. Voices shouted across the mist, keeping boats from colliding. Once, Thomas glimpsed the shadow of another raft sliding past, so close he could hear the children crying inside. By midday, they entered a narrow canyon where the river surged between sheer cliffs. "Stay to the center," Davidson called, his raft leading the way. The water boiled, crashing against rocks. Pa's face was tight with concentration, every muscle straining on the oar. For a terrifying moment, their raft spun sideways, broadside to the current. Water surged over the edge, soaking supplies. Thomas grabbed a barrel before it rolled into the river. Then Pa wrenched the oar and the raft jerked straight. They shot through the rapids like an arrow, bursting out into wide, calmer water. The cheer this time was wild, almost hysterical. Relief so strong it felt like laughter. That evening, around campfires on a rocky shore, the children began retelling the day's adventure as if it were a grand game. "Did you see Pa's face?" Sarah teased, her voice still hoarse but stronger now. "Looked like he swallowed a lemon." Even Ma laughed, though Pa rolled his eyes. But no one slept easy. They all knew worse rapids lay ahead, the Cascades, the deadliest stretch of the Columbia. Stories told of boats dashed to pieces, families swept away. Oregon was close, almost within reach, but the river demanded its price. As Thomas lay awake, listening to the roar of water in the darkness, he realized something. The plains, the prairies, the mountains, they had all tested body and spirit. But the river tested something else: trust. Trust in what lashed together, trust in neighbors on nearby rafts, trust in family holding on tight. And trust in the belief that Oregon, green, fertile, promised, waited beyond the rapids. For 2 days the rafts drifted westward, carried by the Columbia's swift current. The river was wide, almost peaceful in places, but no one let their guard down. Everyone knew what lay ahead: the Cascades. Rapids so fierce they had swallowed entire wagon trains in years past. Davidson spoke little, but his warnings were sharp. "When we reach the Cascades, it'll be chaos. Stay centered. Follow my lead. If you fall in, pray you can swim." The morning they reached them, the river's voice grew louder. A distant roar at first, like thunder rolling through mountains, then constant, deafening. The gorge narrowed, cliffs pressing close, the current accelerating with terrifying force. Thomas clung to the bow as the raft began to buck and sway. Sarah's hands clutched Ma's skirts in the shelter. Pa braced at the stern, the steering or jerking like it wanted to rip free. "Steady," Davidson shouted from the lead raft, his voice barely audible over the roar. Then the river dropped. Not a waterfall, but a violent plunge over jagged shelves of rock. The raft slammed down into boiling foam. Water surged over the sides, drenching everyone. Supplies shifted, barrels rolling. Thomas lunged, catching one before it slipped away. Another wave crashed, knocking Emma sideways. Ma grabbed her just in time, both clinging to the shelter frame. Pa roared, muscles straining as he fought the oar. A raft behind them wasn't so lucky. The Johnson's boat struck a rock broadside. Wood splintered with a crack like gunfire. Screams echoed as the raft began to break apart. Men on other boats threw ropes, pulling children from the water. Mr. Johnson clung to his fiddle case even as he flailed in the current. Miraculously, they were dragged to safety, coughing and shivering, but their raft was lost, swallowed whole by the Cascades. Fear spread like wildfire. "We'll never make it," Mrs. Wilson cried. But Davidson's raft surged forward, his men steering with brutal precision. "Keep right. Follow me." Pa obeyed, sweat streaming despite the icy spray. The raft spun dangerously close to a jagged outcrop. Thomas's breath froze in his chest. Then at the last second, Pa hauled the oar with a grunt, swinging them wide. The raft scraped rock, wood splintering, but held. The current seized them again, dragging them through churning white water. Waves rose taller than wagons, crashing down with bone-shaking force. Thomas thought of all they had endured, the prairies, the mountains, the winter snows, and realized the trail itself wasn't the final test. The Columbia was. Hours, or minutes, it was impossible to tell, passed in a blur of noise and motion. Then suddenly the roar diminished. The river widened. The current eased. The Cascades were behind them. The rafts drifted into calmer water, battered but afloat. Families clung to each other, coughing, crying, laughing all at once. On shore they regrouped. The Johnsons huddled by a fire, soaked to the bone but alive. Mr. Johnson opened his fiddle case, revealing the instrument miraculously intact. "Well," he croaked, "guess the devil himself doesn't like fiddle music." The camp erupted in weary laughter, even as they wrung water from clothes and bandaged cuts. Pa examined their raft, running calloused hands over splintered planks. "She'll hold," he said with a grim smile. "Oregon's not rid of us yet." That night, the campfires burned bright against the dark cliffs. Children whispered retellings of the ordeal, each exaggerating their bravery. Sarah, still coughing but with a spark in her eyes, declared, "When we plant our orchard, I'll name the first tree Cascade, so we remember we beat it." Thomas laughed, though quietly. He couldn't shake the memory of the Johnsons' raft splitting apart, or the look in Pa's eyes as he fought the oar. Survival was never guaranteed. It was clawed, scraped, wrestled from the jaws of the wilderness. Yet in the calm after the storm, hope felt stronger than ever. The Cascades had tried to break them and failed. Davidson stood by the fire, his face illuminated in flickering light. 2 more days to Fort Vancouver, he told the weary group. From there, the valley awaits. 2 more days. After 2,000 miles, endless graves, and near death on the river, Oregon was no longer a dream. It was just beyond reach. As Thomas lay down beside the fire, wrapped in damp blankets, he stared at the starlit sky. The river still roared faintly in the distance, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a promise. The morning after the Cascades dawned clear and cold, the air sharp with pine and river mist. The rafts, patched and creaking, floated more smoothly now as the Columbia widened. No one spoke much. Exhaustion hung heavy, but beneath it pulsed a quiet joy. They had survived. By late afternoon, Thomas spotted something new. A blocky silhouette against the riverbank, larger than any fort he had seen since independence. As the sun dipped low, the outline resolved into walls, buildings, and the flutter of a flag. "Fort Vancouver," Davidson announced, his voice hoarse but steady. Civilization at last. The sight electrified the weary train. Mothers hugged their children tighter. Men straightened their backs. Even the oxen, trudging along the distant Barlow Road under hired drovers, seemed to sense the nearness of shelter. The rafts pulled ashore just below the fort. Soldiers in blue coats and settlers in rough homespun greeted them, lending hands to secure lines and haul supplies up the bank. The contrast between these well-fed men and the gaunt immigrants was stark. Inside the palisade walls, the fort felt like another world. Warehouses stacked with barrels, workshops clanging with the sound of hammers, and a proper store stocked with goods they hadn't seen in months. Sugar, tea, candles, even bolts of colorful cloth. Sarah's eyes lit up at the sight. "It's like a palace," she whispered, though her cough rattled in her chest. Ma's lips pressed tight, torn between relief and worry. "Let's not spend more than we must," she murmured to Pa. "We need seed tools, not finery." The family's turn at the trading post came with both wonder and pain. Pa traded away his last gold coin and one of Ma's wedding spoons for seed wheat, a new plowshare, and a sack of salt. Ma sighed as she let the spoon go, fingers lingering on it like saying goodbye to family. "It'll feed us next spring," Pa said gently. "That's worth more than silver." Around the fire that night, settlers who had been in Oregon for years shared stories. They spoke of fertile valleys where the soil was so rich that crops grew tall without much effort. They told of neighbors who built sturdy cabins, orchards heavy with apples, streams thick with fish. But they also warned of hard winters, isolation, and disputes over land claims. "It's no Eden," one weathered farmer said, poking at the fire with a stick. "But it's close enough if you've got grit." The words settled over the group like both blessing and challenge. 2 more days, Davidson said, to reach Oregon City and the valley beyond. Just 2. Yet the last choice loomed: which route to take? The infamous Barlow Road cut over the Cascade Mountains, shorter but already choked with snow and ice. The river route, longer but less deadly, would float them down the Columbia's remaining miles to the Willamette. Davidson gathered the families in the fort's courtyard. "The road's near impassable this late," he declared. "We'll raft the rest of the way. It's dangerous but not suicide. With God's grace, the river will carry us home." Some muttered that the river nearly killed them already. But no one argued. The thought of turning back was unthinkable. That evening, Thomas and Pa walked along the fort's wall, looking west where the Columbia bent toward unseen country. The sunset painted the sky in crimson and gold. "Do you think it'll be worth it?" Thomas asked quietly. Pa rested a heavy hand on his shoulder. "We've buried friends. We've left pieces of ourselves behind on that trail. But what's ahead? Land of our own, a future for your sister, for you, that's worth everything." For the first time, Thomas believed it fully. The trail hadn't just carried them west, it had remade them. That night, laughter rose in the fort's common hall as weary pioneers shared food with soldiers and trappers. Even humor crept back into the camp. Old Mr. Johnson tuned his fiddle, rescued from the river like a miracle, and played a jig so lively that even Pa tapped his foot. "Play it faster." Sarah croaked through a laugh, clapping her hands. Emma joined in, her cheeks glowing in the firelight. For a brief moment, the misery of the trail seemed far away. Tomorrow they would set out again. Tomorrow the river would decide their fate one last time. But tonight, inside the strong walls of Fort Vancouver, they were safe. Thomas lay awake long after the fiddle went silent, staring at the rafters above. His body ached, his scars throbbed, but his heart burned with a new certainty. Oregon was no longer a dream whispered around campfires. It was just days away. And nothing, not snow, not hunger, not even the Columbia's fury, would stop them now. The last stretch down the Columbia passed in a blur of spray, cold air, and aching muscles. After the terror of the Cascades, the river seemed almost merciful. There were still rapids to navigate, eddies that spun the rafts like tops, but Davidson's steady hand and Pa's fierce grip on the oar kept disaster at bay. For 3 days, the river carried them west, the landscape transforming as if to welcome them. The towering cliffs softened into rolling hills. Forests thick with fir and cedar spread to the horizon, their scent sharp and clean. Flocks of geese wheeled overhead, a promise of fertile wetlands and abundant life. On the morning of the 4th day, a settlement came into view. A handful of buildings, smoke curling from chimneys, nestled along the riverbank. Davidson raised his arm. "Oregon City," he shouted, his voice breaking with something that sounded like relief, or perhaps disbelief. Cheers erupted across the rafts. Mothers wept openly. Children pointed and shouted. Even the men who had lost so much smiled through their beards. After 2,000 miles, after death and hunger and snow, they had reached the end. The landing was chaos. Men splashed into the shallows to haul the rafts ashore. Women clutched children to their chests as they stepped onto solid ground. Sarah clung to Thomas's hand, her cough still rattling but her eyes wide with wonder. Emma stood beside her, grinning like she had discovered a new world. Inside Oregon City, reality mingled with dream. The town was small, fewer than 50 buildings, but to weary travelers, it looked like a metropolis. A blacksmith's hammer rang from a shop. Chickens scratched in the dirt lanes. A general store bustled with settlers trading produce and lumber. Most astonishing of all, there was a church with a white steeple pointing heavenward. Pa stood in the center of the muddy street, turning slowly. "Well," he said with a long exhale, "this'll do." Within days, families began filing land claims under the Donation Land Act. Pa and Ma staked theirs in the Willamette Valley, guided by settlers who knew the best soil. When Thomas first saw the valley, his breath caught. It was everything Emma had promised Sarah during those freezing nights in the winter camp. Rolling meadows, a clear creek, forests alive with deer and birds, mountains in the distance crowned with snow. Ma's hands trembled as she touched the soil, rich and black. "It's real," she whispered. "It's ours." Building began at once. The first shelter was crude, just a lean-to against a log, but within weeks the men had raised a cabin. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and even small windows with panes of glass. Sarah declared it the grandest palace in Oregon, though the roof leaked and the floor was packed dirt. Neighbors helped with the work, and your family returned the favor when the Jenkins or Millers raised their cabins. Out here, no one survived alone. Spring brought the first planting. Wheat, beans, and corn from seeds carried all the way from Missouri sank into Oregon earth. Ma planted herbs and vegetables behind the cabin. Sarah and Emma tied ribbons to a young apple sapling gifted by another settler, naming it Cascade, in honor of the rapids they had survived. Life was still hard. Winters were wet and bone-chilling, if less deadly than the mountains. Food had to be grown, preserved, bartered. Wolves howled from the forests at night. But there was land, water, and hope. More than they'd ever had before. One evening, Pa sat with Thomas on the cabin's rough-hewn porch, watching the sun bleed gold and crimson across the valley. Smoke curled from neighbors' chimneys and children's laughter floated on the breeze. "You remember that first night in Independence?" Pa asked quietly. "I told you this journey would make a man out of you." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't the boy who had left Missouri. He carried scars, memories of graves by the trail, the roar of the Columbia, the endless march of hungry days. But he also carried strength, carved into him mile by mile. Pa smiled faintly. "You proved me right." That night, the family ate stew from their own garden, bread baked with flour they had traded from neighbors. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As the fiddle music of Mr. Johnson floated from a cabin down the valley, Sarah leaned against Thomas and whispered, "It was worth it. Every mile." Thomas looked out at the darkening hills, the land now theirs, and knew she was right. The Oregon Trail wasn't just a road across a continent, it was a forge. It burned away weakness, tested faith, and left behind something stronger. Families bound not just by blood but by survival, by the fire of shared struggle. The boy who left Independence would never return. In his place stood a young man, a pioneer, ready to carve a life from the wilderness. And as the stars appeared one by one over the Willamette Valley, Thomas felt a deep certainty settle in his bones. The journey was over, but the story had just begun.